Story 1. I'm a truck driver in rural Texas. Strange things happen around here. For me, it started as any normal day. But this one time, while transporting a load of walnuts down to San Antonio, I took a shortcut I'd heard about at a gas station. He'd said it'd shave off a good 30 miles, but warned me about the Whispering Creek stretch. I figured he was just yanking my chain. 30 miles is 30 miles. The turnoff was barely marked, a dirt track barely wider than my rig. I bumped along for about an hour, the sun setting like a molten orange behind the gnarled trees, casting long, skeletal shadows across the path. It was dead quiet. That's when I first started to feel uneasy. Then, I saw it. Up ahead, a faded wooden sign half hidden in the brush read, Whispering Creek. Below it, someone had scrawled in what looked like dried blood, "Turn back." I chuckled nervously. Superstitious nonsense. I pushed on. The creek itself was shallow and sluggish, its banks choked with reeds. As I rumbled across the rickety wooden bridge, I heard it. A low, sussurrating whisper, like 1,000 voices murmuring just out of earshot. It seemed to emanate from the water, a chilling, sibilant chorus. I cranked up the heater, telling myself it was just the wind rustling through the reeds. But the whispers grew louder, clearer. Suddenly, my headlights flickered and died. I swore, fumbling for my flashlight. When the beam sliced through the darkness, I saw them. Standing knee-deep in the creek, pale, gaunt figures. Their clothes tattered and stained. Their eyes, wide and black, stared up at me with a hunger that made my stomach churn. They started to move, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Wading towards the truck, their whispers morphing into a gravelly chant. Panic clawed at my throat. I slammed the truck into gear and floored it, the engine roaring back to life. I heard a sickening thud as I clipped one of the figures, but I didn't dare look back. I just drove, my heart pounding like a drum solo. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, the lights of a small town twinkling in the distance like a promise of sanctuary. I pulled over, shaking so violently I could barely hold a cigarette. My hands were slick with sweat, my clothes drenched despite the heater. I took deep, ragged breaths, trying to calm myself. When I looked back, the dirt track was gone. Vanished. There was nothing but unbroken scrubland stretching back into the darkness. I reported the incident to the local sheriff, a portly man with a walrus mustache and a skeptical frown. He listened patiently, then told me about local legends of Whispering Creek, of travelers who disappeared without a trace, of strange lights and unsettling sounds. He even mentioned a statistic. Over the last 50 years, 27 people have been reported missing in the vicinity of the creek, a disproportionately high number for such a sparsely populated area. 70% of the missing were truck drivers, 20% were local residents, and 10% were tourists. He said he'd send someone out to investigate, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. I never took that shortcut again. Even now, years later, the memory of those pale figures, their hungry eyes and chilling whispers, still haunts me. I stick to the main roads, no matter how long the journey. Some things, some places, are best left undisturbed. I kept driving, but the unsettling feeling lingered. A week later, I was back in that same town, unloading a shipment of fertilizer. I stopped for coffee at a diner and saw a newspaper article about a local fisherman who'd found a human skull in Whispering Creek. It was described as being remarkably well preserved, despite its age, which was estimated to be at least a century old. The article also mentioned a peculiar detail. The skull was missing its lower jaw. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I remembered the thud I felt when I clipped one of the figures. Could it have been? I tossed the newspaper aside, trying to dismiss the thought. But the unease remained, a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers echoed in my mind, the image of the pale figures, their empty eye sockets and gaping mouths, burned into my memory. I decided to go for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. As I strolled down the quiet street, I noticed a group of people gathered near the edge of town, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a bonfire. Drawn by a morbid curiosity, I approached them. They were locals, mostly older folks, and they were talking in hushed tones about Whispering Creek. One of them, an old woman with a wrinkled face and piercing blue eyes, saw me and beckoned me over. "You're the trucker?" she asked, her voice raspy. I nodded hesitantly. "They've been restless lately," she said, her gaze fixed on the flames. "The whispering ones." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What do they want?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The old woman smiled, a chillingly toothless grin. "They want their voices back," she said. "They want their stories to be heard." Suddenly, the wind picked up, and the whispers started again. Louder this time, closer. The people around the fire began to chant, their voices blending with the whispers, rising to a crescendo of unearthly sound. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached my truck. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could, leaving the town and its chilling secrets behind. I never looked back, but I'll never forget the whispers, the pale figures, and the terrifying realization that some stories are best left untold. Story 2. The sun blood orange across the flat Texas landscape, painting the scrub brush in hues of fire. I was hauling a load of portable homes, those sad little boxes people try to convince themselves are the American dream, towards El Paso. My mind was occupied with the overdue mortgage payment and the silent treatment my wife had been giving me for a week. That's when I saw him, thumb jutting out beside a rusted-out mailbox shaped like a longhorn. He was lanky, dressed in worn denim and a too big Stetson. His face was shadowed by the brim, but I could make out a thin, scraggly beard. Normally, I wouldn't pick up hitchhikers, but something about the desolate stretch of highway, the burning sky, and the echoing silence nudged me to stop. He climbed in, a faint smell of sage and something else, something metallic clinging to him. "Appreciate it, friend," he mumbled, his voice like gravel rolling downhill. "Name's Kane." But we drove for a while, the silence broken only by the hum of the tires and the distant drone of a crop duster. Kane stared out the window, seemingly captivated by the endless expanse of mesquite and prickly pier. Then he turned to me, his face now bathed in the dying sunlight. His eyes. That's what got me. They were an unnatural yellow, like a wolf's, with pupils that seemed to dilate and contract with every fleeting shadow. "You ever hear about the bargain, friend?" he asked, his voice taking on a strange cadence. I shifted uncomfortably. "Bargain? What bargain?" A slow smile stretched across his face, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too pointed. "The bargain you make to keep what ain't rightfully yours." He tilted his head, his gaze unnerving. "The bargain that keeps the skin on." I laughed, a nervous, brittle sound. "You talking some kind of riddle?" His smile vanished. "No riddle, friend. Truth. See, sometimes the skin don't fit no more. It gets itchy, tight. And you gotta find a way to shed it." But he reached up and scratched his arm, leaving a trail of red welts that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. My stomach churned. "And what do you shed it for?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Something of equal value," he replied, his eyes boring into mine. "A piece of yourself. A memory. A loved one." The portable houses swayed slightly behind me, suddenly feeling like flimsy coffins. "What happens if you can't find something to trade?" I managed to ask. Kane leaned closer, his breath hot against my ear. "Then the skin comes off anyway." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, leather pouch. He opened it, revealing a handful of dried, shriveled. Something they looked vaguely like fingers, but smaller, almost like the digits of a rodent. "These were mine," he said, holding them out to me. "Traded them for my wife's smile. Kept her happy for a spell, till I needed more." My heart hammered against my ribs, fear clawing at my throat. "What do you want from me?" I croaked. He tilted his head again, those unsettling yellow eyes assessing me. "You got a good life, friend. Loving wife, stable job. Something worth trading." Panic seized me. I swerved the rig, tires screaming against the pavement. "Jet out," I yelled, my voice raw with terror. Kane's eyes flashed with anger, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks. "You can't escape the bargain, friend. It always comes due." He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. His fingers felt cold, almost reptilian. I saw the skin on his hand begin to ripple, to shift, as if something was trying to push its way out. "Let go," I screamed, wrenching my arm away. I slammed on the brakes, the rig skidding to a halt. Kane stumbled back, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The skin on his face began to peel away, revealing glimpses of something dark and sinewy beneath. He lunged at me, his transformed hand outstretched, claws extended. I scrambled out of the rig, stumbling into the scrub brush. Kane followed, his inhuman cries echoing across the desolate landscape. I ran, the thorns tearing at my clothes, the dry earth crunching beneath my feet. I didn't look back, but I could hear him, the sound of his pursuit growing closer, punctuated by the sickening sound of tearing flesh. I ran until I collapsed, breathless and bleeding, beside a barbed wire fence. The sun had finally set, leaving the world painted in shades of indigo and black. I listened, straining my ears. But the only sound was the whisper of the wind through the dry grass. He was gone. For now. But I knew the bargain wouldn't be forgotten. It was waiting, lurking in the shadows, ready to collect its due. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the price would be everything. Story 3. The setting sun bled crimson across the San Antonio sky, painting the Alamo in a macabre light. I pulled my rig into a deserted lot a few blocks from the historic mission, a familiar pain throbbing in my lower back. Another long haul. Another night sleeping in the cab. I grabbed a lukewarm beer from the cooler and leaned against the truck, the cool metal a welcome relief against my sweaty shirt. I cracked open the can, the fizz a momentary distraction from the oppressive Texas heat. Across the street, tourists milled around the Alamo, their voices a distant hum. History soaked the very ground I stood on, a stark contrast to the mundane reality of my life, delivering frozen chicken parts across the state. As twilight deepened, the tourists dispersed, leaving the Alamo covered in an almost palpable silence. I finished my beer and contemplated crawling into the sleeper cab, but something held me back. An almost magnetic pull emanating from the old mission. I told myself it was just curiosity, a desire to experience a slice of history outside the confines of my 18-wheeler. I crossed the street, my boots crunching on the gravel path leading to the Alamo's entrance. The heavy wooden doors were closed, but even from the outside, I could feel a distinct chill in the air. Suddenly, a low rumble vibrated through the ground, a rhythmic chugging that couldn't be mistaken for city traffic. I looked around, expecting to see a passing freight train, but the surrounding streets were deserted. The rumbling grew louder, accompanied by a high-pitched shriek of metal scraping against metal. Then I saw it, emerging from the shadows behind the Alamo. A spectral train materialized, its engine belching forth not smoke, but an ethereal mist that glowed faintly in the deepening gloom. The train cars themselves appeared to be constructed of aged, dark wood, their windows revealing flickering candlelight within. As it drew closer, I could make out figures inside the train cars. Soldiers, clad in tattered uniforms, their faces pale and drawn. They moved slowly, almost mechanically, as if reenacting some grim pantomime. One soldier clutched his stomach, a crimson stain blooming on his uniform. Another stared blankly ahead, his eyes hollow and vacant. The train passed directly in front of me, close enough that I could see the anguish etched on the soldiers' faces. They didn't seem to notice me. Their attention focused on some unseen horror within the train car. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of blood, and I could hear the faint moans and whispers of the dying. The last car was open, revealing a scene that sent a jolt of pure terror through me. A pile of bodies lay heaped within, limbs twisted at unnatural angles. A single figure, presumably an officer, stood over the pile, his sword dripping with a viscous, dark fluid. He raised the sword and brought it down again and again, a silent scream contorting his face. The train continued to move, its ghostly wheels making no sound as they rolled across the pavement. I stood there, paralyzed by fear, as the spectral train disappeared into the night, the rumbling slowly fading into silence. The scent of blood lingered in the air, a grim reminder of the horrors I had witnessed. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there in the chilling silence. But my legs felt like lead, my voice trapped in my throat. Slowly I turned and looked back at the Alamo. The mission stood silent and imposing in the darkness, its walls seemingly holding centuries of pain and suffering. I suddenly understood the magnetic pull I had felt earlier. It wasn't just curiosity that had drawn me to the Alamo, it was something far more sinister. The Alamo wasn't just a historical landmark, it was a gateway, a portal to a realm of unimaginable horror. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I stumbled back towards my truck. I fumbled with the door handle, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I climbed into the cab, slammed the door shut, and locked it, as if a thin sheet of metal could protect me from the horrors I had just witnessed. I sat there for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Was it a hallucination, a product of stress and exhaustion? Or was it something real, a glimpse into the dark underbelly of history? As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, I finally started the engine and pulled away from the Alamo. I didn't look back, afraid of what I might see. I knew I would never forget the ghost train, the faces of the fallen soldiers, their silent screams forever echoing in my mind. The Alamo, once a symbol of Texan courage, had become, for me, a symbol of unimaginable horror. A chilling reminder that some battles are never truly over, some wounds never truly heal, and that some places are best left undisturbed. Story 4. The fluorescent lights of the dusty Armadillo truck stop buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the linoleum floor. I'd pulled in after a long haul, craving nothing more than a hot shower and a lukewarm cup of coffee. The aroma of stale grease and burnt coffee hung thick in the air, a familiar scent of countless late-night stops. I pushed through the glass doors and headed for the elevator, a steel box promising quicker access to the rooms above. The elevator doors shuddered open, revealing a surprisingly empty cabin. Usually, these things were crammed with wary travelers. I stepped inside, a wave of unexpected warmth washing over me. It was hotter than it should have been, a dry heat that felt almost baked. I hit the button for the third floor, the doors sliding shut with a metallic groan. The descent began normally enough, a gentle hum accompanying the slow drop. Then, the lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then died, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. A chill, sharper than the refrigerated trailer I'd just decoupled from, snaked up my spine. A low growl, guttural and unsettling, filled the sudden silence. It vibrated through the floor, through the walls, through my very bones. Fear, cold and clammy, tightened its grip around my throat. I fumbled for my phone, the screen illuminating my trembling hand. No signal. Of course. The growling intensified, joined by a chorus of whispers slithering around me like unseen snakes. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, but instinctively knew I didn't want to. The temperature in the elevator climbed rapidly, the air thick with the smell of sulfur and something else, something akin to rotting meat. Then, the elevator lurched, dropping with stomach-churning speed. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, laced with a chilling glee. My phone slipped from my grasp, clattering onto the floor. I braced myself against the wall, the metal burning hot against my palms. The elevator finally screeched to a halt, throwing me against the door. The doors shuddered open, not onto the brightly lit third floor, but onto an abyss. Flames. A swirling vortex of orange and black roared beyond the threshold, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the elevator. The heat was unbearable, a blast furnace aimed directly at my face. The whispers became shrieks, triumphant and cruel. Figures began to emerge from the flames, their forms shifting and distorted, barely human. Twisted limbs, elongated shadows, eyes burning with an unnatural fire. They reached for me, their clawed hands grasping at my clothes, their burning gazes fixed on my face. One of them, taller than the rest, stepped forward. Its skin was charred and cracked, revealing glimpses of the fiery inferno beneath. A pair of horns, jagged and black, protruded from its skull. It smiled, a horrifying rictus that stretched its face into a grotesque mask. "Welcome," it rasped, its voice a grating combination of screams and whispers. "To your final destination." A terror, raw and primal, flooded through me. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the opposite wall, as far from the fiery abyss as possible. The creatures advanced, their burning eyes filled with a predatory hunger. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. The heat intensified, searing my skin. The shrieks grew louder, closer. I felt a clawed hand grasp my arm, its burning touch searing through my jacket. Another hand grabbed my leg, pulling me towards the flames. I opened my eyes one last time, gazing into the swirling inferno. The horned figure stood at the edge of the abyss, its smile widening, its eyes burning with triumphant malice. Then, I felt myself falling, plunging into the fiery depths, the screams of the demonic entities echoing in my ears as the world dissolved into a consuming, all-encompassing inferno. Story 5. The advertisement on the tour-based message board was simple: hauling delicate cargo, San Antonio to El Paso, $5,000 cash. No questions asked. My bank account was emptier than a politician's promise, so I didn't ask questions. A burner phone call, a meeting at a deserted truck stop outside of San Antonio, and a heavy wooden crate later, I was on I-10 West, $5,000 richer in anticipation. The guy who handed off the crate was twitchy, skinny as a rail, with eyes that darted around like trapped fireflies. He smelled like stale cigarettes and fear. He gave me a single instruction: don't open it, for $5,000. For not opening a crate. Seemed easy enough. But the weight of the thing, it felt wrong. Like it held something far denser than wood and whatever fragile item it supposedly contained. And there was a faint, sweet odor emanating from it, like overripe fruit and something else, something metallic, coppery. A few hours outside of San Antonio, near Junction, I started seeing them. Flickering shapes at the edge of my vision, dark against the twilight. At first, I dismissed them as fatigue-induced hallucinations. But they persisted, growing more defined, more numerous. Shadowy figures, gaunt and impossibly tall, their forms seemingly woven from the very darkness that clung to the highway's edges. Then came the whispers. Not through my ears, but somehow, inside. My head, a sibilant chorus of unintelligible sounds that scraped against my sanity. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, pushing the gas pedal down a little harder, desperate to outrun the growing dread that coiled in my gut. Near Fort Stockton, a rest stop beckoned. I pulled in, the engine rumbling to a stop. The whispers intensified, pressing against my skull. I glanced at the crate in the sleeper berth. The coppery smell was stronger now, almost overwhelming. My hand trembled as I reached out, drawn to it by a morbid compulsion I couldn't explain. Inside the crate, nestled in layers of packing straw, was a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was no bigger than my hand, but it radiated an unnatural warmth. Etched into its surface were symbols I didn't recognize, twisting, arcane glyphs that seemed to squirm beneath my gaze. Protruding from the box's lid was a single, tarnished silver key. The whispers reached a fever pitch. The shadows outside the truck solidified, dozens of them now, their long, skeletal fingers reaching, grasping. Against my better judgment, Against every screaming fiber of my being, I took the key and inserted it into the lock. The click was impossibly loud in the sudden, absolute silence that followed. The box sprung open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, dried human tongue. It was shriveled and black, but impossibly, the tip pulsed with a faint, sickeningly red glow. The world outside the truck erupted. The shadows converged on the vehicle, their whispers transforming into guttural shrieks that tore at my eardrums. They slammed against the metal, their forms distorting, stretching, becoming something less than human, more than animal. Panic seized me. I slammed the box shut, fumbled with the lock, desperate to contain whatever horror I had unleashed. But it was too late. The truck's windows shattered, showering me with glass. The shadows poured in, their forms flickering and shifting in the dim light of the sleeper berth. Their touch was icy, burning cold, draining the warmth from my body. I remember screaming. I remember the coppery tang of blood filling my mouth. I remember the weight of their bodies pressing down on me. The feeling of something sharp tearing at my flesh. Then, nothing. I woke up in a hospital bed in El Paso, bandaged and bruised, but inexplicably alive. The doctors talked about a massive truck accident, a hallucination brought on by head trauma. They found no trace of the crate, the box, or the shadowy figures. But I remember. I still hear the whispers, faint now, but always there, lurking at the edges of my consciousness. I see flickers of movement in my peripheral vision, elongated shadows that stretch and distort in the corners of dimly lit rooms. And I smell it, constantly. That sweet, coppery scent. The smell of fear and something ancient, something evil. They gave me a small, plastic container when I left the hospital. It contained my belongings salvaged from the wreckage. Among the twisted metal and shattered glass, there was one item that shouldn't have survived. A single, tarnished silver key. Story 6. The cicadas were screaming. A deafening chorus that seemed to vibrate the very asphalt beneath my 18-wheeler's tires. It was the kind of heat that baked the tar until it shimmered like black water. The kind that made a man question his sanity for choosing a life on the road. I hauled livestock, mostly cattle, and the pungent aroma clung to me like a second skin. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it paid the bills. My mama always said, "A man's gotta do what a man's gotta do." Tonight, though, something felt different. A prickling sensation crawled up my spine, an instinctual unease that had nothing to do with the oppressive heat. I chalked it up to fatigue, to one too many cups of lukewarm coffee from roadside diners. Then I saw it. A flicker of movement in the rearview mirror. Something too fast, too erratic to be a normal vehicle. I adjusted the mirror, squinting, and my heart leaped into my throat. A dark, unmarked sedan was tailgating me, closing the distance with unsettling speed. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles bone white. My mind raced. Was it road rage? Had I accidentally cut someone off miles back? I tried to recall any recent driving infractions, but my mind came up blank. As the sedan pulled closer, its headlights illuminating the interior of my cab, I saw them. Two men in dark suits, their faces obscured by shadows and wide-brimmed hats. There was something about their stillness, their lack of expression, that chilled me to the core. Then, a figure emerged from the tree line beside the road. It stumbled into the beam of my headlights, and I almost slammed on the brakes. It was humanoid, but grotesquely elongated, its skin a sickly, translucent gray. One arm hung at an unnatural angle, and its head lolled to the side, revealing a gaping wound where its ear should have been. Its eyes, though, God, its eyes, were enormous, black pools reflecting the headlight beams like polished obsidian. The creature scrambled towards my truck, its movements jerky and unnatural. It let out a series of high-pitched whimpers, sounds that were more animal than human. In that moment, everything clicked. The rumors I'd overheard at truck stops, the whispered tales of Area 52, the government's hush-hush testing facility nestled deep within the Nevada desert. This thing was an escapee, and those men in the sedan were cleaning up the mess. The creature reached the passenger side of my truck, its clawed hand slapping against the door. I could see its distorted face pressed against the window, its breath fogging the glass. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. I hit the gas, flooring it, the tires spinning briefly before finding purchase. The sedan behind me roared to life, matching my speed. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a flash of light, followed by a sharp crack. They were shooting at me. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was trapped between a government cover-up and a living nightmare. I swerved wildly, trying to lose the sedan. But it clung to me like a shadow. The creature inside my cab continued to shriek and pound against the passenger door, the sound a grating counterpoint to the roar of the engine and the pursuing sedan. I had to do something. I had to get rid of it. Ahead, I saw a sign. Wake station. Next exit. It was a long shot, but it was the only thing I could think of. I took the exit, my tires squealing in protest, and barreled into the brightly lit way station. The sedan followed, screeching to a halt behind me. The two men emerged, their faces now clearly visible in the harsh fluorescent lights. They were expressionless, their eyes cold and calculating. One held a gun, the other a strange, cylindrical device that hummed with an unnerving energy. I stumbled out of the truck, my legs shaky, my mind reeling. "Help!" I yelled, my voice hoarse. "There's something in my truck, something not human." The men advanced on me, ignoring my pleas. They didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge my presence. Their focus was solely on the creature inside the cab. Suddenly, the passenger door of my truck swung open, and the creature lunged out. It landed on the asphalt with a sickening thud, its limbs twitching. The men raised their weapons. But before they could fire, something incredible happened. The cylindrical device the second man held began to glow, emitting a pulsating blue light. The light intensified, bathing the way station in an eerie luminescence. And then, the creature began to change. Its elongated limbs retracted, its skin returned to a normal flesh tone, its grotesque features softened. The gaping wound on its head closed, leaving behind unblemished skin. Within seconds, the creature had transformed. It stood before us, naked and trembling. A young man, no older than 20, with short cropped brown hair and wide, frightened eyes. The men lowered their weapons, their faces still impassive. One of them gestured towards the young man, and he followed them obediently back to their sedan. They got in, the car turned silently, and drove away, disappearing into the night as if they had never been there. I stood there, alone in the brightly lit way station, the pungent smell of cattle still clinging to my clothes, the cicada's chorus now a dull hum in the distance. I looked back at my truck, at the empty passenger seat, at the faint scratch marks on the window where the creature's claws had been. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me deeper than any Texas night, that I had witnessed something I was never meant to see. And I knew, just as surely, that I would never speak of it again. Story 7. The cicadas thrummed a relentless symphony of heat, their song vibrating through the cab of my Peterbilt as I hauled a load of factory-made homes towards Corpus Christi. It had been 3 days since the first sighting, just outside of El Paso. A flicker of something enormous against the dying sun, wings impossibly wide, casting a shadow like a falling building. I told myself it was a trick of the light, the desert playing tricks on my tired eyes. But the second sighting, the next night in Odessa, solidified the growing unease in my gut. The same impossible silhouette, briefly illuminated by the neon glow of a roadside diner, then gone. Mothman. I'd scoffed at the stories before, dismissing them as Appalachian folklore, something for tourists to gawk at. Now, I was seeing it myself, here in the heart of Texas. The third sighting happened last night, just outside of San Antonio. This time, perched atop a water tower, its silhouette clear against the rising moon. Its eyes, huge and reflective, seemed to bore into me, accusing. And then, a new element, a horrifying premonition, flashed through my mind. It showed a bridge collapsing, twisted metal and concrete falling into a churning river, and myself trapped within the wreckage. This unshakable premonition had settled deep in my bones. A cold knot of certainty that tightened with every mile closer to Corpus. I kept replaying the image of the collapsing bridge in my head, trying to discern any details. The type of bridge, the surrounding landscape. Nothing concrete, just a visceral sense of impending doom. I started taking detours, avoiding any overpasses or elevated highways. My delivery was already late, but another late delivery fee seemed insignificant compared to the abyss of my premonition. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my eyes scanning the horizon, looking for anything out of place. The normal Texas landscape, flat, scrubby, punctuated by the occasional oil derrick, suddenly seemed menacing. Every mesquite bush a potential hiding place for the winged harbinger of disaster. My detour led me onto Highway 77, a two-lane blacktop snaking through endless fields of sunflowers. Their heavy heads bowed under the afternoon sun. I'd been on this road once before, years ago, hauling a load of walnuts to Brownsville. I vaguely remembered a bridge somewhere along this road. A long, high span over the Nueces River. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. As I drove, the sunflower fields began to give way to thicker vegetation. The air grew heavy with the humid smell of the approaching coast. Then, I saw it. In the distance, a towering structure of concrete and steel arched across the Nueces. It was the bridge from my vision, exactly as I'd pictured it. My heart hammered against my ribs. My hands became slick with sweat, my breath catching in my throat. The bridge loomed larger with each agonizing second, a concrete monument to my impending demise. I slammed on the brakes, the Peterbilt screeching in protest, the tires leaving black streaks on the asphalt. I had to stop. I had to turn back. But another, equally powerful force compelled me forward. I couldn't explain it, but I felt I had to cross that bridge almost as if fulfilling some twisted prophecy. My foot trembled over the gas pedal. I took a deep breath, the humid air thick in my lungs. Then, with a resignation born of fear and morbid fascination, I pressed down on the accelerator. The bridge seemed to stretch on forever, each span an eternity. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My eyes darted back and forth, searching the sky, the water, the tree line, expecting to see the Mothman at any moment. As I reached the midpoint of the bridge, a loud crack echoed through the air. The truck lurched violently. I looked in my side mirror and saw a section of the bridge behind me crumble and fall into the churning river below. My premonition was coming true. Panic clawed at my throat. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, the engine roaring, the tires screaming against the remaining concrete. Another section of the bridge collapsed ahead of me. I was trapped. Then, I saw it. Perched on the remaining section of the bridge, just ahead of me, was the Mothman. It was larger than I'd ever imagined, its wings spanning the width of the highway. Its eyes, glowing red in the fading sunlight, were fixed on me. It let out a deafening shriek, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. The remaining section of the bridge began to crumble. The truck tilted precariously, the front wheels dangling over the edge. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable plunge. Then, silence. I cautiously opened my eyes. The truck was still, balanced precariously on the edge of the collapsed bridge. The Mothman was gone. Below, the Nueces River churned angrily. I somehow managed to climb out of the cab and onto the remaining section of the bridge. I stood there, trembling, my legs feeling like jelly. I looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then I saw it. Scrawled on the remaining concrete, in what looked like dried blood, was a single word. Next. A story 8. The sun beat down on my dusty Peterbilt, baking the Venel seats. I'd been hauling scrap metal from El Paso to Houston for the better part of 2 days, and I was craving a real bed. not the cramped confines of my sleeper. Outside of Odessa, I saw them. 3 figures huddled by the roadside, thumbs outstretched. 2 men and a woman, looking harmless enough. I hesitated. Picking up hitchhikers wasn't exactly company policy, but something about their tired faces, their worn clothes, tugged at me. I pulled over. The woman, thin with stringy blonde hair, climbed into the passenger seat. One man, burly with a shaved head and a tattoo of a coiled snake on his neck, squeezed in the middle. The other, scrawny with nervous eyes that darted everywhere, took the jump seat. "Thanks for stopping," the woman said, her voice surprisingly melodic. "We're headed to Corpus." "No problem," I replied, easing back onto the highway. "Name's Earl." "Darlene," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "This here's Ricky," she gestured to the burly man. "And this is Vernon." Ricky grunted a greeting. Vernon just stared straight ahead, his fingers twitching. The first hour passed without incident. They talked about the heat, about jobs they were hoping to find in Corpus. Normal stuff. But as we approached San Antonio, things started to get strange. Darlene began humming a tuneless melody under her breath, a repetitive, almost hypnotic sound. Ricky started muttering to himself, his eyes glazed over. Vernon's twitching intensified, his fingers drumming a frantic rhythm against his thighs. I glanced at them in the rearview mirror. Their faces seemed different somehow, sharper, their eyes glowing with an unnerving intensity. I told myself I was just tired, but a knot of unease began to tighten in my gut. Just outside of Victoria, Darlene stopped humming and turned to me, her eyes now wide and unblinking. "Earl," she said, her voice taking on a strange, sing-song quality. "Do you believe in destiny?" Before I could answer, Ricky grabbed my arm, his grip like a vise. "We have a purpose, Earl," he growled, his voice low and menacing. Vernon let out a high-pitched giggle, a sound utterly devoid of humor. I tried to pull my arm away, but Ricky's grip tightened. Fear, cold and sharp, flooded through me. These weren't just wary travelers. Something was terribly wrong. "What are you doing?" I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. Darlene's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too pointed. "We're fulfilling our destiny, Earl," she said, her eyes fixed on mine. "And you're going to help us." Vernon produced a long, thin blade, the metal gleaming in the fading sunlight. He held it up, tracing the edge with a trembling finger. "This is how it has to be," he whispered, his voice barely audible. My mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. I slammed on the brakes, hoping to throw them off balance. The truck screeched, the tires protesting against the sudden stop. For a moment, they were disoriented. It was my chance. I wrenched open the driver's side door and stumbled out, sprinting towards a nearby field. I could hear them behind me, their shouts echoing in the twilight. I ran as fast as I could, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I could hear the pounding of their boots behind me, gaining ground. I glanced back. Ricky was closing in, his face contorted in a terrifying grimace. Suddenly, I tripped, falling hard onto the uneven ground. Pain shot through my ankle. I tried to get up, but my ankle wouldn't support my weight. I was trapped. Ricky loomed over me, his shadow stretching across the field. He raised the blade, the metal glinting in the dying light. Then, a piercing siren cut through the air. A police car, its lights flashing, pulled up beside the truck. Ricky froze, his eyes wide with surprise. The other 2 emerged from the truck, their faces etched with panic. 2 officers approached, their weapons drawn. "Freeze," one of them shouted. Ricky hesitated, then dropped the blade. Darlene and Vernon raised their hands in surrender. Later, as I sat in the back of the police car, my ankle bandaged, I learned the truth. The 3 weren't just hitchhikers. They were escaped patients from a mental institution near Odessa. They had a history of violence, a shared delusion about a destiny, that involved traveling to the coast and performing a ritual sacrifice. I had unwittingly become their next victim. I never picked up another hitchhiker. The memory of those glowing eyes, those sharp teeth, those whispered words about destiny still haunts me. The Texas landscape, once a symbol of freedom and open roads, now holds a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface, waiting for an unsuspecting soul to offer a ride. Story 9. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in hues of bruised purple and blood orange. My rig, loaded with bleeding sheep destined for a San Antonio slaughterhouse, was parked on the edge of the sprawling Kincaid Ranch. Old man Kincaid, face like weathered leather, had waved me off after paying me $20 to park overnight. Brush wolves, he'd rasped, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. They're bold this year. I settled into the front seat with a lukewarm can of Dr. Pepper and a bag of beef jerky. The sheep rustled nervously in the trailer, their collective breath a low, mournful sigh carried on the evening breeze. It wasn't an ideal stopover, but it beat paying for a truck stop, and Kincaid had assured me the spot was safe. As darkness solidified, the sheep grew quiet. Too quiet. I chalked it up to exhaustion, finished my jerky, and stretched out across the bench seat. Just as I drifted off, a high-pitched, almost bird-like screech cut through the night. The sheep erupted in a cacophony of panicked bleats. I bolted upright, grabbing the maglite from the glove box. The screech came again, closer this time, followed by a sickening wet thud. My pulse hammered in my ears as I cautiously swung open the driver's side door. The beam of my flashlight danced across the ground, revealing nothing but dust and the long shadows cast by the mesquite trees. Then I saw it. A dark shape crouched over a still form near the back of the trailer. Even in the dim light, I could make out the hunched posture, the long, spindly limbs, and what looked like wings. Another screech, closer still, and the shape darted away, disappearing into the darkness with unnerving speed. My hand trembled as I aimed the flashlight at the still form. It was one of the sheep. Its throat was torn open, drained of blood. Too small. Puncture wounds marked the skin, almost perfectly symmetrical. I scrambled back into the cab, heart pounding against my ribs. Brush wolves didn't make those sounds. Brush wolves didn't leave puncture wounds like that. My mind, against all logical reasoning, conjured up stories whispered at dusty truck stops. Tales of a creature that stalked the night, draining the lifeblood of livestock. The chupacabra. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the cab, maglite clutched in my hand, every rustle of leaves, every chirp of a cricket sending jolts of fear through me. Just before dawn, I finally fell into a fitful sleep, plagued by nightmares of glowing red eyes and leathery wings. The rising sun brought a fragile sense of relief. I cautiously stepped out of the cab, dreading what I might find. 5 more sheep lay dead, all drained of blood, all bearing the same telltale puncture wounds. The others huddled at the far end of the trailer, their eyes wide with terror. I called Kincaid, my voice shaking. He listened patiently, then let out a dry chuckle. Chupacabra, eh? You city folk and your tall tales. He agreed to meet me at the ranch entrance. When he arrived, he surveyed the carnage with a detached expression. Brush wolves, he repeated, though his eyes held a flicker of something else, something that looked suspiciously like fear. He offered me a few $100s for my trouble, and I took it, eager to put the whole gruesome incident behind me. As I pulled away from the Kincaid Ranch, I saw something move in my rearview mirror. A dark shape perched atop a distant windmill, silhouetted against the morning sky. It looked like a large bird, but its posture was wrong. Too hunched, too still. Then it spread its wings. They were long, leathery, and far too large for any bird I'd ever seen. I hit the gas, leaving the Kincaid Ranch and its chilling secret in the dust. I never looked back, but the image of those wings, those puncture wounds, the chilling silence of the slaughtered sheep, stayed with me. It's a memory that still surfaces in my nightmares, a chilling reminder of the night I encountered the Chupacabra's feast. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that old man Kinkhead knew exactly what stalked his land, and that the brush wolves were merely a convenient lie. A way to keep the horrifying truth hidden in the shadows of the Texas night. Story 10. The buzzards were the first sign. Not just a few circling lazily, but dozens. A swirling black vortex against the bleached canvas of the Texas sky. They hung over something on the shoulder near El Paso, something I initially dismissed as another deer casualty of the endless highway. But something tugged at me, a flicker of unease in my gut. I pulled my rig over, the gravel spitting from beneath the tires, and walked back. It wasn't a deer. It was a brush wolf, meticulously arranged. Its limbs were splayed out, forming an almost perfect circle, and its snout pointed due east. Surrounding it were smaller animals, rabbits, armadillos, even a few birds, all positioned in a precise pattern I couldn't decipher. Their eyes, glazed over in death, seemed to stare accusingly. A single, withered sunflower lay on the brush wolf's chest. I backed away slowly, a prickle of fear crawling up my spine. This wasn't natural. This was deliberate. 50 miles down the road near Van Horn, I saw it again. Another circle, this time comprised of javelinas, their bristly hides gleaming in the afternoon sun. The same sunflower, inexplicably fresh, rested on the largest one's back. The buzzing of the flies was a morbid symphony, underscored by a low, croaky hum that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it vibrated in my bones. That night, I stopped at a truck stop outside of Fort Stockton, desperate for a break from the unsettling images. Inside, a handful of other drivers were huddled around a table, their faces grim. I overheard snippets of conversation, strange roadkill, whispered rumors of rituals, ancient gods. One grizzled veteran, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, spoke of a forgotten deity, a being of shadow and bone worshipped by a sect long thought extinct. They used the road as their altar, he said. Their sacrifice is a perverse offering. I tried to dismiss it as superstition, the product of long hours and lonely roads. But the image of those circles, those vacant eyes staring into eternity, kept flashing through my mind. The next morning near Ozona, I found the third circle. This one was different. It was larger, composed of livestock, sheep, goats, even a young calf. Their bodies were arranged in a spiral, leading inward to a single, horrifying centerpiece. A human form, covered in a dark cloak. The sunflower, now wilting, lay upon its chest. The humming was stronger now, a palpable vibration that shook the ground beneath my feet. The buzzards, hundreds of them, formed a living, breathing cloud above. I stumbled back to my truck, my hands trembling, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't just a ritual. This was a summoning. I drove on, fueled by a desperate need to escape. To put as much distance as possible between myself and that gruesome tableau. But the circles kept appearing, growing larger, more elaborate, the humming intensifying with each one. The animals became more exotic, a bobcat, a mountain lion, even a lone pronghorn. The human forms, too, changed, their cloaks replaced by tattered remnants of what looked like ceremonial robes. Near Sonora, I saw it. The final circle. It spanned the entire width of the highway, a grotesque tapestry of death. Hundreds of animals, their bodies intertwined, their eyes staring blankly skyward. In the center, a figure stood, robed in black, its face hidden by a horned mask. The sunflower, now completely black and desiccated, lay clutched in its skeletal hand. The humming had become a roar, a deafening cacophony that reverberated through the earth. The sky above churned, the clouds swirling into a vortex of black and purple. The buzzards had descended, a ravenous tide of feathers and beaks. I slammed on the brakes, my rig skidding across the asphalt. I had to turn back to escape this madness. But as I wrestled with the steering wheel, a cold dread washed over me. I realized, with a chilling certainty, that the road behind me was gone. The highway stretched endlessly in front of me, leading straight into the heart of that infernal circle. The robed figure raised its hand, a slow, deliberate gesture. The humming intensified, reaching a fever pitch. And then, the earth beneath my truck began to tremble. Cracks appeared in the asphalt, spreading like spiderwebs across the road. From the depths of those fissures, a sickly yellow light began to emanate, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced and squirmed like living things. The figure lowered its hand, and the earth split open. A gaping chasm, filled with that unearthly yellow light, yawned before me. The buzzards shrieked, a deafening chorus of anticipation. And from the heart of that abyss, a voice rose, a voice ancient and terrible, a voice that spoke not in words, but in the primal language of fear. My truck lurched forward, pulled inexorably towards the edge. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew, with a terrible certainty, that this was the end. This was the price of the road. Story 11. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in hues of bruised plum and faded apricot. I pulled my rig off the main highway, somewhere past Waxahachie, onto a dirt track barely wide enough for the 18-wheeler. A sign, half hidden by kudzu, proclaimed it, Kincaid Ranch Road, a shortcut. It shaved 30 minutes off my route to Houston, and tonight, 30 minutes felt like a lifetime. I needed to deliver this load of factory-made housing units before sunrise. The track narrowed, the mesquite crowding in, their branches scratching against the trailer's canvas top. A prickle of unease settled in my gut. I'd heard stories, hushed whispers at truck stops about Kincaid Ranch, about strange things happening on this road. Superstitious nonsense, I told myself. I kept driving. As twilight deepened, the whispers started. Faint at first, like the rustle of dry leaves, then louder, a chorus of voices just beyond the edge of hearing. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, yet somehow, I knew they were calling my name. I rolled down the window, hoping the sound of crickets and cicadas would drown out the voices. It didn't. Instead, the whispers intensified, pulling me deeper into the woods. The track twisted and turned, the trees growing denser, their gnarled limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air grew heavy, thick with a sickly sweet scent like overripe peaches. Then I saw them. Circles. Perfect circles carved into the earth, bare patches amidst the dense undergrowth. They were spaced evenly, growing larger as I drove, almost as if they were expecting me. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't just some shortcut. This was something else. Something ancient. I stopped the truck, the silence amplified by the preceding whispers. I considered turning back, but the whispers urged me forward, promising something I couldn't quite grasp. Something waiting for me at the heart of the woods. The largest circle yet loomed ahead, bathed in an unnatural yellow light. In the center stood a wooden structure, intricately carved with symbols I'd never seen before. It looked like some kind of altar. And around it, figures. They were human, or at least, they looked human from a distance. Clad in ceremonial robes of faded velvet, their faces hidden by deep hoods, they stood motionless, their silence more terrifying than any scream. As I watched, one of the figures raised its hand, and the whispers stopped. A chilling silence descended, broken only by the frantic thumping of my own heart. The figure gestured towards the altar, and a second figure emerged from the trees, dragging something behind it. It was wrapped in white cloth, but the shape was unmistakably human. My stomach lurched. This wasn't just some backwoods ritual. This was a sacrifice. And I had a terrible premonition that I was about to become a participant. The figure on the altar produced a knife, the blade glinting in the sickly yellow light. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, the truck roaring to life. Tires spun in the loose dirt, but finally found purchase. I careened through the circle, the robed figures scattering, their whispers turning to shrieks of rage. I drove blindly, branches whipping against the windshield, the whispers pursuing me, growing louder, more insistent. The circles flashed past, markers on a terrifying race against something I couldn't comprehend. Then I saw it. A bridge. Rickety, made of ancient wood, it spanned a churning black river. It was my only way out. I hit the accelerator, the truck rumbling onto the decaying structure. The wood groaned under the weight, the river churning hungrily below. As I reached the midpoint, the bridge began to collapse. The robed figures stood on the riverbank, their faces finally visible in the moonlight. Their features were wrong. Elongated, almost reptilian, their eyes burning with an unearthly yellow light. They weren't human. The bridge gave way, the truck plunging into the darkness. As I fell, I saw them, their forms silhouetted against the sickly yellow sky, their leathery wings unfurling. The whispers became a single voice, ancient and powerful, speaking my name, welcoming me home. And then, everything went black. I woke up in my truck, parked on the side of the highway. The sun just beginning to rise. It was as if the entire night had been a dream, a nightmare. But then I saw it, a single withered sunflower lying on the dashboard. A chilling reminder of the circles in the woods, of the whispers, of the things with wings. And I knew, with a terrible certainty, that they were still out there, waiting for me to take the shortcut again. Story 12. The fluorescent lights of the big Texan diner buzzed, casting a sickly yellow glow across the Formica tables. I pulled my rig into the near-empty lot, just a beat-up Ford pickup and a gleaming black Cadillac. Figuring a cup of coffee and a slice of pie would hit the spot before I finished my haul to El Paso. Inside, the air hung thick with the scent of stale coffee and something else, something faintly metallic and sweet. Darlene, the waitress, a woman with stringy blonde hair and a name tag pinned crookily to her uniform, gave me a vacant smile.
"Just you, hon?" "Yeah."
Just me. I slid into a booth, the vinyl sticking to my jeans. The only other patron was a man in the Ford, hunched over a bowl of chili. He never looked up. Darlene slapped a menu down, and I scanned it. The usual Grazy Spoon fare. But something felt off. The print seemed to shimmer, the letters rearranging themselves into unsettling words I couldn't quite grasp. I blinked, and it was gone. Just a regular menu. I ordered coffee and apple pie. The cook emerged from the back. He was a large man, his face hidden by a Grazy chef's hat, his apron stained crimson. He moved with a strange, jerky fluidity, his gaze fixed on me. It made my skin crawl. He spoke to Darlene in a low, croaky rumble I couldn't make out. Darlene returned with my coffee, a chipped mug filled with lukewarm, bitter liquid. "Cook says the apple pie's all gone. How about cherry?" I shrugged. "Cherry's fine." And when she brought the pie, it looked wrong. The crust was an unnatural, deep purple, the filling bubbling sluggishly like congealed blood. A single, perfect cherry sat in the center, gleaming like a polished ruby. The metallic sweet smell was stronger now, almost overpowering. I hesitantly took a bite. The crust was strangely tough, the filling thick and cloying, leaving a bitter aftertaste. The cherry burst in my mouth, a rush of metallic tang that made me gag. I spat it out onto my plate. It rolled across the Formica, leaving a thin red trail. The cook was watching me, a disturbing grin spreading across his face. He spoke again to Darlene, his voice a low, gravelly chant. She giggled, a high-pitched, unsettling sound. The man in the Ford finally looked up. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, fixed on me with a desperate intensity. He mouthed a single word. "Run." I scrambled out of the booth, throwing a 20 on the table. Darlene's giggle turned into a shriek. The cook lumbered towards me, his movements no longer jerky but swift, predatory. I burst through the diner doors and into the night. The black Cadillac was gone. I jumped into my rig, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, tires spitting gravel. In the rearview mirror, I saw the cook standing in the doorway of the diner, his silhouette framed by the sickly yellow light. He raised his hand, and I swear I saw something glint in his grasp. A long, curved blade. I drove for what felt like hours, my heart hammering against my ribs, the image of the cook's face, now clearly visible in my mind, pale, gaunt, with eyes that burned with an unnatural yellow light, seared into my memory. I stopped at a truck stop just before dawn, shaken and exhausted. I tried to tell the other drivers about the big Texan diner, about the cook, the pie, the unsettling feeling. They just chuckled, dismissing it as a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by too much coffee and too many miles. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I tasted. And I knew I would never stop until I understood the horrifying truth of that demonic diner. 2 weeks later, I read a small article in a local Texas paper about the big Texan diner burning to the ground. The cause was undetermined. They never found the cook or Darlene. I still avoid cherry pie and late-night diners, especially in Texas. Story 13. The walnut pie was still warm, the crust flaking delightfully under my fork. I savored the sugary sweetness. A welcome treat after 12 hours hauling furniture from Dallas to El Paso. The rest stop was deserted, save for a rusting Ford pickup and my own rig. Dusk was settling, painting the sparse mesquite trees in shades of purple and gray. I figured I'd grab a few hours of sleep before tackling the final leg of my journey. As I climbed back into my truck, a peculiar sight caught my eye. 3 figures were standing near the edge of the rest stop, their backs to me. They were unusually still, almost like statues. I dismissed them as weary travelers, probably stretching their legs after a long drive. I woke up what felt like hours later, disoriented. The digital clock on my dash blinked 2 a.m. The same 3 figures were still there, in the exact same position. A flicker of unease ran through me. No one stands that still for that long. I decided to investigate. Everything all right out there? I called out as I approached. They didn't react. Hello. I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. As I got closer, I noticed their clothing. It was old-fashioned, like something out of a Western movie. The woman wore a long, faded calico dress, while the 2 men sported worn denim overalls and dusty felt hats. Something about them felt wrong. I reached out to tap the shoulder of the nearest man. My hand passed right through him. I stumbled back, a cold dread washing over me. They were translucent, shimmering faintly in the moonlight. Ghosts. Panic clawed at me. I ran back to my truck, fumbled with the keys and jammed them into the ignition. The engine turned over, but the truck wouldn't move. The tires spun uselessly, spitting gravel. I was stuck. Then, the clock on my dash flipped back to 2 a.m. The Ford pickup reappeared, pristine and gleaming. The walnut pie was once again warm, in its plastic container on the passenger seat. The 3 ghosts stood near the edge of the rest stop, their backs to me, motionless as before. I was trapped in a time loop. Over the next few cycles, I learned their stories. The woman, Sarah, had been traveling west with her 2 brothers, Thomas and Elijah, hoping to start a new life in California. Their truck had broken down at this very rest stop in 1933. Stranded and desperate, they had been preyed upon by a gang of highwaymen, their bodies dumped into a nearby dry creek bed. I tried everything to break the loop. I tried driving in a different direction, staying in the truck, even trying to reason with the ghosts. Nothing worked. Every time the clock hit 2 a.m., it reset. The walnut pie, the Ford pickup, the ghosts, all returned to their starting positions. On one loop, I decided to follow the ghosts. They walked silently towards the dry creek bed, their movements jerky and unnatural. At the bottom of the ravine, I saw something glinting in the moonlight. It was a tarnished silver locket, engraved with the initials, SM, Sarah's locket. An idea sparked in my mind. Maybe if I could somehow right the wrong that had been done to them, the loop would break. I spent the next few cycles frantically searching the internet on my phone, of which thankfully continued to function despite the time loop, for information about unsolved murders in the area in 1933. I finally stumbled upon a dusty old newspaper article detailing the disappearance of 3 siblings traveling through Texas. The article mentioned the discovery of a silver locket near a dry creek bed. Armed with this knowledge, I used the time loop to my advantage. I located the sheriff's department mentioned in the article. It was long gone, replaced by a modern office complex. I found the current sheriff, and using information gleaned from repeated loops, convinced him to reopen the cold case. He was skeptical, but the details I provided were too specific to ignore. He agreed to investigate the dry creek bed. On the next loop, as the clock ticked towards 2 a.m., police cars descended upon the rest stop, their lights flashing. Officers unearthed 3 skeletons at the bottom of the ravine, along with the silver locket. As the sheriff secured the crime scene, I watched the 3 ghosts. They turned to face me, their translucent faces etched with an expression of profound peace. Then, they slowly began to fade. The clock on my dash hit 2 a.m. This time it kept going. The walnut pie was still there, half eaten, but the Ford pickup was gone. The ghosts were gone. I was free. The moral weight of what had happened settled heavily on me. I had not only escaped a terrifying time loop, but I had also brought a measure of justice to 3 forgotten souls. As the first rays of dawn illuminated the sky, I pulled out of the rest stop, leaving the ghosts of the past behind and carrying the weight of their story with me. Story 14. The walnut pie at the Buc-ee's outside of Waco was worth every calorie. Sugar rush humming in my veins, I pointed my rig south, bound for Brownsville. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised plum and faded apricot. I'd been hauling freight for 15 years, logged 1,000,000 miles on Texas asphalt, but this stretch of Highway 77 always felt different. The feeling intensified as the towns thinned out. Replaced by endless fields of sunflowers, their heavy heads bowed under the weight of the approaching night. I passed a dilapidated gas station, its single flickering fluorescent light buzzing like a trapped insect. The name, scrawled in faded paint, was Ceres. I'd heard whispers from other drivers about cherries, about the peculiar woman who ran it, about the things that happened after dark. I kept rolling. Around midnight, the sunflower fields gave way to scrub oak and mesquite. The air grew thick, almost suffocating. A strange, cloying sweetness hung in it, like overripe peaches mixed with something else. My CB crackled with static, then a single, distorted voice. "Turn back," it rasped. "He's waiting." I dismissed it as a prankster, but a shiver crawled down my spine. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a deer caught in my high beams. Then it stood, its silhouette clear against the blood-orange glow of the setting sun. It was tall, impossibly tall, easily 8 feet, standing on 2 legs. Its head was elongated, canine, with pointed ears and a snout filled with sharp teeth. The dogman. My foot slammed on the brakes. The rig skidded, tires protesting against the asphalt. The dogman didn't flinch. It just stood there, watching me, its eyes 2 burning embers in the darkness. I slammed the gear shift into drive, the engine roaring back to life. I floored it, leaving the dogman behind in a cloud of dust and diesel fumes. But it wasn't that easy. A mile down the road, I saw it again, perched on a small rise overlooking the highway. It didn't seem to have moved, yet it was there, waiting. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't a hallucination, this was real. The chase was on. The speedometer needle climbed past 80, then 90. The dogman kept pace, loping alongside the truck with an unnerving grace. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, trying to focus on the ribbon of asphalt ahead. Every shadow seemed to hold the dogman, every rustle of leaves sounded like its approach. I tried the CB again, desperate for any sign of life. "Mayday. Mayday. This is Big Rig Bandit southbound on 77. I've got something chasing me." Silence. Then the same distorted voice. "You can't outrun him," it whispered. "He knows these roads." Ahead, the highway curved sharply, disappearing into a thick stand of mesquite. I knew this road. It was a shortcut, barely a dirt track, leading through the sprawling Kincaid Ranch. Normally, I'd avoid it, but I was desperate. Maybe, just maybe, I could lose the dogman in the trees. I took the turn, the rig bouncing violently on the uneven ground. The branches of the mesquite scraped against the sides of the truck, a chilling reminder of the creature pursuing me. The air grew even thicker. The sickly sweet smell intensified. I could hear it now, the padding of its paws on the dirt growing closer. Then, the track opened into a small clearing. In the center stood a stone structure, an altar of some kind, built from rocks. 3 flickering candles illuminated its surface, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. This was no random shortcut. This was a place of ritual, a place of sacrifice. The dogman stood at the edge of the clearing, blocking my path. It let out a low growl, a deep, guttural rumble that vibrated through the very earth. I knew then that this was the end of the line. I had stumbled into something ancient, something primal, and I was the intended offering. I braced myself for the inevitable. The image of those sharp teeth seared into my mind. Then, from the darkness behind the altar, 3 figures emerged. They were dressed in long, flowing robes, their faces obscured by deep hoods. They moved with an unsettling fluidity, their hands outstretched towards me. They were chanting, their voices blending into a low, hypnotic drone. The dogman took a step back, its focus shifting from me to the robed figures. It let out another growl, this one tinged with fear. The figures continued their chant, the sound growing louder, more intense. The air crackled with an unseen energy. The very ground seemed to vibrate. Suddenly, the earth beneath the altar split open, revealing a gaping chasm, a swirling vortex of absolute darkness. The sickly sweet smell intensified, becoming almost overpowering. The dogman whimpered, backing away from the growing abyss. The robed figures stepped closer to the edge, their chant reaching a fever pitch. Then, one by one, they jumped. They didn't scream. They didn't hesitate. They simply offered themselves to the darkness, their bodies disappearing into the swirling void. The chasm began to close, the earth groaning as it sealed itself shut. The dogman let out a long, mournful howl, then turned and vanished into the trees. I sat there, paralyzed, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just witnessed. The silence of the night descended, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant drone of a truck on the highway. I put the rig in gear and drove away. I never used that shortcut again, and I never stopped thinking about the Cherry's gas station and the woman with the vacant smile who probably knew more than she let on. Story 15. The setting sun painted the Texas sky in bruised purples and sickly oranges as I hauled a load of factory-made homes toward Waco. I'd taken a shortcut, a dirt track barely wide enough for my rig, hoping to shave some time off my run. I justified it as entrepreneurial spirit. Time saved was money earned. Plus, nobody used this old road anymore. Not since the bridge collapse 15 years back. I was humming along to George Jones when something flashed across my headlights. Too big for a deer, too low for a cow. I slammed on the brakes, the rig groaning in protest, spitting gravel. A sickening thud followed, a sound that reverberated through the chassis, up my spine, and into the hollow of my gut. Dread, thick and heavy, settled in my chest. I knew somehow that I hadn't hit a stray steer. I climbed down, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My maglite beam cut through the thickening dusk, revealing the crumpled form lying in the middle of the track. It was a child, but not human. Its skin was a mottled gray-brown, covered in coarse, dark hair. Its limbs were thick and disproportionately long. Even in death, its face held a vaguely simian cast. This was no ordinary roadkill. This was a Bigfoot kid. I stood there, frozen, the maglite trembling in my grip. My mind raced, trying to process the impossible. I should call the sheriff, report the accident. But how do you explain running over a mythical creature? They'd lock me up in the nearest mental institution faster than you could say, jackalope. Then, the woods came alive. A low growl, guttural and menacing, echoed through the trees. It was followed by another and another, growing closer, louder. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I scrambled back into the cab, firing up the engine. As I threw the rig into gear, a rock the size of a watermelon slammed against the side of my trailer. I floored it, the truck lurching forward, tires spitting gravel as I roared down the dirt track. The growls chasing me through the deepening gloom. The pursuit intensified. More rocks pelted the trailer, some cracking the fiberglass of the factory-made homes. Through my side mirrors, I saw them, dark, hulking shapes loping through the undergrowth, keeping pace with the truck. Their speed was unnatural, their silence even more so. I hit the paved road, hoping the smoother surface would give me an advantage. It didn't. The Bigfoots, if that's what they were, seemed unfazed by the change in terrain. They were gaining on me. I remembered the collapsed bridge. It was a risk, but maybe, just maybe, it would stop them. The road leading to it was overgrown, barely a track now, choked with mesquite and thorns. I wrestled the wheel, forcing the truck onto the narrow path, branches whipping against the cab, thorns tearing at the paint. The bridge loomed ahead, a skeletal silhouette against the darkening sky. A gap, wide and black, yawned where the central section had collapsed years ago. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I couldn't make the jump. But I had to try. As I approached the precipice, I saw movement on the other side. More Bigfoots. They were waiting for me. They'd herded me here, into a dead end. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt inches from the edge, front wheels dangling precariously over the abyss. The Bigfoots emerged from the trees, surrounding the truck. They were bigger than I'd initially thought, some easily 9 feet tall. They moved with a strange, fluid grace that belied their size. Their eyes, intelligent and filled with a cold fury, burned into me. I was trapped. One of them, larger than the rest, stepped forward. It raised a massive, gnarled hand, and with a deliberate gesture, ripped the driver's side door clean off its hinges. I cowered back against the passenger seat, breath catching in my throat. This was it. This was how I died. But instead of tearing me limb from limb, the large Bigfoot did something unexpected. It reached into the cab, its hand brushing my arm. I recoiled, expecting the crushing grip of death, but it didn't come. Instead, the creature produced a small, tarnished silver locket. It was identical to the one my daughter, Lily, had worn the day she disappeared 5 years ago, presumed drowned in the Nooses River. The Bigfoot placed the locket on the dashboard, its touch surprisingly gentle. Then, it pointed a thick finger at me, then at the locket, then at the crumpled form of the child still lying back on the dirt track. Understanding, cold and terrible, washed over me. I hadn't hit a Bigfoot child. I'd hit Lily. She'd been taken, raised by these creatures, and now I'd killed her again. The large Bigfoot let out a long, mournful howl, a sound filled with an anguish that mirrored my own. The other Bigfoots joined in, their cries echoing through the night, a chilling lament for a life lost, a life I had taken twice. The creatures then retreated into the woods, leaving me alone with my grief and the horrifying truth. I sat there numb, staring at the locket, Lily's locket, the only piece of her I had left. The Texas sky bled into darkness, the silence broken only by the distant murmur of the Nooses River, churning hungrily below. The shortcut hadn't saved me any time. It had cost me everything. Story 16. The sun bled orange across the West Texas plains, painting the sparse mesquite a fiery hue. I rubbed my aching shoulders, another 100 miles under my belt, hauling a load of factory-made housing units towards Corpus. A flicker of movement in my side mirror caught my attention. It was just a tumbleweed, I told myself, but a prickle of unease remained. I hadn't seen another vehicle for hours, and the silence was starting to feel less peaceful, more expectant. Up ahead, a barely discernible track snaked away from the main road. promising quicker access to the coast. My GPS showed the road as unpaved, but I figured my rig could handle it. Besides, I was behind schedule, and the lure of shaving off some time was too strong to resist. As I bumped along the rutted path, the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging me into near darkness. The track narrowed, barely wider than my truck, the mesquite crowding in on either side like skeletal fingers reaching out. I began to regret my decision. Then I saw it. A small clearing up ahead, and within it, a strange structure. As I drew closer, I realized it was a collection of crude wooden crosses, a makeshift graveyard. An inexplicable chill crawled over my skin. This wasn't on any map. I pulled over. The crunch of tires on gravel loud in the sudden stillness. A weathered leather pouch lay on the ground near the first cross. Curiosity overriding my unease, I picked it up. Inside, nestled among dried herbs and something that smelled faintly of overripe peaches, was a tarnished silver locket. I flipped it open. A tiny, faded photograph of a man in denim overalls stared back at me. He looked vaguely familiar. As I examined the locket, a peculiar detail caught my eye. Each of the crosses bore a small, almost perfectly symmetrical circle carved into the wood. I recognized the shape. It was the same symbol stamped on the back of the locket. Suddenly, a glint of metal in the dying light. Further into the clearing, almost hidden by the encroaching shadows, stood a weathered wooden altar. And on that altar, something glinted again. A curved blade. My breath caught in my throat. A rustling in the mesquite. I spun around, the locket slipping from my sweaty hand. A figure emerged from the darkness. Tall, gaunt, draped in flowing robes. Another followed, then another, until 3 robed figures stood before me, their faces obscured by shadows. They began to chant a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the ground beneath my feet. The chant intensified, becoming a horrifying symphony of distorted whispers. The circles on the crosses seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. My heart hammered against my ribs. Then I saw their faces. Gaunt, almost skeletal, their eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. And in their hands, they held more lockets, identical to the one I'd just dropped. Each locket bore the picture of a different man, each dressed in denim overalls. Truckers, I understood then. This was a trucker's graveyard. And I was next. The figures moved with an unsettling fluidity, their robes swirling around them like a vortex. They closed in, their chant reaching a fever pitch. I stumbled back, desperately searching for a way out. But the mesquite seemed to press in on me, blocking my escape. One of the figures raised a hand, a long, skeletal finger pointing towards the altar. The blade glinted in the macabre moonlight. My mind screamed. Then a sound. A distant, rhythmic chugging growing steadily louder. A train. Out here, the robed figures paused, their heads turning towards the sound. A momentary distraction. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled back to my truck, fumbling with the keys, the engine roaring to life. As I slammed the truck into reverse, I saw the figures turn back towards me, their faces contorted in silent screams. Tires spinning, gravel flying, I burst out of the clearing and back onto the track. The rhythmic chugging was closer now, almost deafening. And then I saw it. Not a train. A massive 18-wheeler. Its headlights blazing, barreling towards me. But there was something wrong. The truck was ancient, rusted, its paint peeling, the cab seemingly filled with shadowy figures. And on its grille, painted in faded white, a single, familiar symbol. A perfect circle. The truck roared past, a blast furnace aimed directly at me, the force of its passing throwing my rig off the track. I braced myself for the inevitable plunge, the churning river below yawning like a fiery abyss. But instead, the earth split. A gaping chasm opened beneath me, swallowing the truck whole. The last thing I saw, before the darkness consumed me, were the 3 robed figures standing at the edge of the abyss, their faces illuminated by an unearthly yellow light. Their chant echoing in the deepening gloom. and clutched in their hands a tarnished silver locket bearing my picture. Story 17. The flat tire was a blessing, I see that now. Or maybe a curse dressed up as one. I was hauling a load of factory-made housing units towards Corpus Christi, a job I'd taken on short notice, eager for the extra cash. My GPS glitched out somewhere around Junction, leaving me stranded on a dirt track barely wide enough for my rig. As dusk bled into the inky Texas night, I spotted a distant flicker of light. A beacon in that desolate expanse. Following the track, which thankfully continued, I eventually reached a cluster of low-slung buildings, nestled among dried herbs and stunted mesquite. No signs of life, no vehicles, just the soft rustle of wind through the scrub. One of the structures, larger than the rest, had a single window where the light emanated, a dim, flickering candlelight within. It looked vaguely familiar, a half-remembered image from a dog-eared Texas travel brochure. Curiosity overriding any sense of caution, I cautiously swung open the heavy wooden doors. The interior was surprisingly empty. Dust motes danced in the candlelight, illuminating rough, wooden furniture and walls seemingly holding centuries of history. In the center stood a long table, meticulously arranged with something. I couldn't quite grasp it at first, my eyes struggling to focus in the dim light. Then, a prickling sensation crawled up my spine. Nestled among dried her robes of what looked like teeth. Human teeth. A cricket chirped, sending jolts of unease through me. Then, a voice, raspy and ancient, whispered from the shadows, "Welcome, traveler. Join us for supper." Three figures emerged from the darkness, their forms flickering in the candlelight. Their faces seemed different, somehow, elongated and almost skeletal. They wore simple, faded calico dresses, their movements jerky and unsettling. Their silence was more unnerving than any scream. Just looking for a phone," I stammered, desperately searching for an escape route. The doors behind me seemed to have sealed themselves shut. Flat tire. The figures moved closer, their eyes, black pools reflecting the candlelight, fixed on me. The voice spoke again, this time with a chillingly toothless smile. "We have everything you need here, traveler. Stay. Nourish." My heart hammered against my ribs. I stumbled backward, knocking against the table. A small article slipped from a tattered newspaper. A peculiar detail caught my eye. It was a small article about a bridge collapse 15 years prior, somewhere along this very stretch of highway. 3 siblings traveling through Texas, never found. Presumed drowned. And then I noticed their clothing, the faded calico dresses, identical to the ones worn by the figures before me. A cold dread washed over me, a terrible certainty settling in my gut. These weren't just some backwoods ritualists. These were the ghosts of those lost siblings, trapped here, repeating some horrific cycle. And I was about to become a part of it. One of the figures gestured towards the table, revealing the horrifying centerpiece. A stew, simmering in a large iron pot. Floating within it were chunks of something pale and familiar. And then I understood. The teeth. The missing siblings. The strange roadkill I'd seen on the way here. It all clicked. The figures stepped closer still, their hands outstretched towards me. Their touch, surprisingly gentle, belied their predatory hunger. My voice trapped in my throat. I could only stare as they dragged me towards the table. Towards the bubbling stew, towards my inevitable demise. A giggle, high-pitched and almost bird-like, echoed through the room. Another followed, and then another, blending into a horrifying symphony. The sickly sweet smell of the stew intensified, almost suffocating. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my limbs felt heavy, my will dissolving. The figures lowered me towards the pot, their faces etched with a triumphant malice. The light flickered, casting grotesque shadows across the room. The stew churned, revealing glimpses of bone and other things I couldn't quite process. And then, darkness. Not the darkness of unconsciousness, but the absolute darkness of being consumed, of becoming a part of something ancient and horrifying. my silent screams forever echoing in that desolate cabin of cannibalistic ghosts. Story 18. The girl materialized just outside Waco, a shimmer in the heat haze rising off the asphalt. One moment the shoulder was empty. The next she stood there, thumb jutting out, a faded apricot dress clinging to her frame. I almost missed her, my mind preoccupied with the ticking clock of my delivery schedule. Frozen goods don't wait for ghostly apparitions. She looked young, maybe 16, with stringy blonde hair plastered to her forehead. Her face was obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed straw hat, but I could make out a hint of a smile. An unsettlingly familiar smile. I slowed, a flicker of unease replacing my initial annoyance. Something about her presence, it felt wrong, like a cold spot in the sweltering Texas heat. Then I recognized the tarnished silver locket around her neck, a coiled snake biting its own tail. My gut clenched. It was identical to the one I saw, no, just a trick of the light. I pressed the gas pedal, leaving the girl behind, a phantom hitchhiker swallowed by the dust cloud billowing in my wake. That should have been the end of it. But as I drove, the nagging sense of familiarity grew into a gnawing dread. The temperature in the cab plummeted despite the blazing sun outside. I rolled down the window, hoping a blast of hot air would chase away the sudden chill, but the air that rushed in was icy, carrying the faint scent of overripe peaches. Peaches. Why did that smell evoke such a visceral fear? The locket, the peaches. Pieces of a forgotten memory, shards of glass in my mind, reflecting a horrifying truth I'd buried deep. Junction was my next stop. I needed to clear my head, grab some fuel and coffee. Maybe some real food, something other than the stale crackers and lukewarm water I'd been subsisting on. As I pulled into the gas station, I noticed the girl again, standing by the diesel pumps, her hat still obscuring her face. This time, she wasn't smiling. Her head was tilted, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I averted my gaze, quickly filled the tank, and hurried inside. The attendant, a woman with a name tag pinned crookedly to her denim overalls, gave me a strange look. "You see her too, huh?" she mumbled, her eyes darting towards the window. "See who?" I asked, playing dumb, though my heart pounded against my ribs. "The girl," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one with the peaches. Da peaches." The word hung in the air, thick with unspoken dread. Before I could press her further, the bell above the door chimed, and a group of bikers entered, their laughter cutting through the oppressive silence. The attendant busied herself with their orders, and I retreated to my truck, the unsettling encounter leaving me shaken. I pushed on, determined to put as much distance as possible between myself and Junction, and the girl, and the unsettling memory that refused to fully surface. As darkness fell, the oppressive heat gave way to a bone-chilling cold. The radio, which had been my only companion for the past few hours, began to malfunction, spitting out static and distorted whispers. Then the whispers coalesced into a single, chillingly familiar voice. "You left me," it hissed, the sound emanating from the empty passenger seat. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding on the deserted highway. The cab was empty, bathed in the eerie glow of the dashboard lights. But the voice remained, a phantom presence whispering in my ear. "You left me to die." It repeated, the words laced with a chilling malice. And suddenly, I remembered. 15 years ago, a summer road trip with my girlfriend Sarah. A roadside peach stand. A quarrel. Me driving off in anger, leaving her stranded on the side of the road, her thumb outstretched, a tarnished silver locket glinting in the setting sun. The locket, a gift from me. A coiled snake biting its own tail, a symbol of eternity. An eternity she never got to experience. I never reported her missing. Convinced myself she'd hitchhiked to the next town. Eventually found her way home. But deep down, a terrible certainty lingered. A certainty confirmed by a small article I'd read months later. A brief mention of a Jane Doe found near Junction. Her body decomposed, a tarnished silver locket the only clue to her identity. The voice intensified, filling the cab with an icy dread. "You promised forever?" it whispered. "Come now. Forever is yours." The temperature plummeted further, frost forming on the inside of the windshield. The image of Sarah, her face now clear beneath the straw hat, materialized in the passenger seat. Her eyes hollow, her lips twisted into a horrifying rictus. The scent of overripe peaches, now thick and cloying, filled the air. I felt a searing pain in my chest, like 1,000 icy needles piercing my heart. I screamed, a sound swallowed by the growing darkness. The last thing I saw was Sarah's face, inches from mine, her vacant eyes burning with a cold, vengeful light. Then, the truck swerved violently, the world outside dissolving into a swirling vortex of black. My forever had begun. Story 19. The heat hung thick in the cab of my rig, a damp blanket, stifling any breeze that dared sneak through the cracked window. I was hauling a load of factory-made concrete gargoyles, a grotesque things destined for some McMansion in Odessa, and the eerie silence they exuded seemed to seep into the very air. My only companion was the crackling static of my CB, a constant, if irritating, presence on these long Texas hauls. Around Junction, the static sharpened, a whine cutting through the usual fuzz. Then, a voice, thin and reedy, whispered, "Turn back." I gripped the wheel tighter, chuckling. Some joker with a voice modulator. "Funny, buddy." I barked into the mic. "Real funny." The voice returned, closer this time, a sibilant rasp that sent a shiver down my spine. "He waits at the third circle." A third circle? What third circle? I dismissed it as a prank, but the hairs on my arms prickled. The Texas landscape, normally a comforting monotony of scrub and sky, suddenly felt menacing. Every clump of mesquite seemed to hold a hidden threat, every shadow stretched long and unnatural in the twilight. Miles later, I spotted it. A circle of stones, almost perfectly formed. In the middle of nowhere, unease knotted in my gut. 2 more circles appeared, spaced evenly along the highway, each one larger than the last. The CB crackled again, the voice now a chilling chorus of whispers. "The offering is due." I pressed the accelerator, desperate to put distance between myself and those unsettling circles. The gargoyles rattled in the trailer, their silent disapproval a palpable weight. As I approached the third and largest circle, an unnatural yellow light pulsed from its center. My truck bucked, the engine sputtering as if starved of fuel. I pulled over, heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The CB shrieked, the whispers merging into a single, gravelly voice. "He is pleased." From the circle, 3 robed figures emerged, their faces obscured by cawls. They moved with an unnerving fluidity, their hands outstretched as they glided towards my truck. Panic seized me. I fumbled for my tire iron, my only weapon against whatever ritual was unfolding before me. The robed figures stopped, their silent presence radiating an ancient, malevolent energy. They gestured towards the trailer, towards my cargo. A horrifying understanding washed over me. The gargoyles weren't just grotesque decorations. They were an offering. The CB shrieked again, the voice now a triumphant roar. "The pact is sealed." The robed figures moved closer still, their hands reaching, their forms shifting, becoming something less than human, something more reptilian. I slammed the truck into reverse, the tires spitting gravel as I fought to escape. The engine roared back to life, a desperate surge of power that propelled me away from the circle. Away from the robed figures, away from the chilling certainty that I had stumbled upon something ancient and evil. The CB fell silent, the only sound the frantic thumping of my heart against my ribs. I drove through the night, the image of those robed figures seared into my mind. I never looked back, never slowed down, never stopped until I reached the safety of the interstate. The normalcy of the truck's stop lights a welcome refuge from the macabre moonlight. I delivered the gargoyles to Odessa, never mentioning the circles, the robed figures, or the terrifying whispers from the CB. I replaced the radio, but the silence in the cab is never truly silent. I still hear the whispers in the quiet stretches between towns, in the rustle of the mesquite, in the darkness that stretches beyond the headlights. I still see the circles appearing in my dreams, a constant reminder of the night I became part of a pact I never agreed to, a pact sealed with concrete and whispered promises in the heart of Texas. Story 20. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in shades of bruised purple and sickly orange. I gripped the steering wheel of my Kenworth, the familiar rumble beneath me a comforting vibration. I was hauling a load of factory-made concrete gargoyles, grotesque things, destined to adorn some McMansion. Tonight's destination, Corpus Christi. I'd been pushing hard, eager to make up lost time. Took a shortcut I vaguely remembered, a farm-to-market road that promised quicker access. As the paved road gave way to gravel, a gnawing unease settled in my gut. This wasn't the shortcut. The GPS insisted I was on course, but my gut screamed otherwise. Then the whispers began. Not from the radio, I'd switched it off hours ago. These whispers seemed to emanate from the truck itself, a low, guttural murmur in some primal language I couldn't understand, yet somehow felt in the marrow of my bones. I tried dismissing it as fatigue, but the whispers intensified, weaving themselves into a chilling chant. The truck lurched, the steering wheel resisting my control. I slammed on the brakes, but the truck kept moving, gaining speed. I was a passenger in my own rig. Panic clawed at my throat. I wrestled with the wheel, fighting the unseen force that propelled us forward. The truck bucked and swayed, threatening to throw us off the barely there track. We passed crude wooden crosses, spaced evenly along the roadside, each adorned with a single withered sunflower. Each cross seemed to amplify the whispers, the chant growing louder, more insistent. Then, the gargoyles in the trailer began to shift. I could hear them grinding against each other, a brittle sound like bone on bone. The truck roared, an inhuman sound, and the speedometer needle climbed past 80, past 90, the engine screaming in protest. We were hurtling towards something. The track opened onto a small clearing. In the center stood a stone structure, bathed in an unnatural yellow light. It was circular, almost perfectly symmetrical, with arcane glyphs carved into its surface. 3 robed figures stood before it, their faces obscured by deep hoods, their hands outstretched in welcome. Or was it menace? Terror threw me like a jolt of electricity. I recognized the symbol carved into the stone. I'd seen it before, stamped on a tarnished silver locket I'd found in a roadside antique shop. The locket had a strange weight, a palpable vibration, and I'd bought it on a whim, drawn to its unsettling energy. The truck showed no signs of slowing. The chanting reached a fever pitch. The gargoyles screeching in a horrifying symphony. I fumbled for the locket, pulling it from my shirt pocket. The metal burned against my skin. The whispers intensified. The chant now a deafening chorus. I squeezed the locket, desperate for some kind of reprieve, some way to break this nightmare. As the truck barreled towards the stone structure, the robed figures lowered their hoods. Their faces were not faces. Smooth, polished obsidian, reflecting the sickly yellow light like 1,000 malevolent eyes. And in the center of each obsidian face, a perfect circle carved, mimicking the glyphs on the stone, mimicking the design on the locket clutched in my burning hand. The truck slammed into the stone structure. I remember a deafening crack, the world dissolving into a blinding flash of unnatural yellow light. Then, nothing. I woke with a gasp, strapped into a hospital bed. A nurse bustled around me, her face etched with concern. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. "A massive truck accident. They found your rig well. There wasn't much left." She showed me a newspaper article. A picture of the wreckage, twisted metal and charred remains. The article mentioned the strange circular stone structure found at the crash site, a local landmark supposedly containing ancient Native American glyphs. No mention of the robed figures, the chanting, the burning locket. They released me a few days later. I tried to tell them what I'd seen, the whispers, the obsidian faces. They diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress, prescribed me medication. They never believed me. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. That burning touch, the chilling whispers, the terrible certainty that I was not in control. I still have nightmares. I see those obsidian faces, those perfect circles, the sickly yellow light. I sold the trucking business, moved away. I tried to forget. But the whispers remain. A faint echo in the quiet moments. A constant reminder of the night my truck became possessed. And I became a pawn in some ancient, horrifying ritual. And I still avoid anything remotely circular, especially cherries. Story 21. The refrigerated unit hummed, a low, steady drone against the Texas heat. I was hauling frozen chicken parts, specifically feet, from a processing plant in Waco to Corpus Christi. Not glamorous, but it paid the bills. My name's Dale, by the way. Dale Higgins. About 100 miles outside of San Antonio, I pulled over at a roadside fruit stand. Needed a bathroom break and some fresh peaches. The woman running the place, skinny with a sun-baked face and missing teeth, had a peculiar glint in her eye. She gave me a handful of small, dried, shriveled-looking peaches, almost black, for free. For luck, she rasped, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. I thanked her, a little creeped out, and tossed them on the passenger seat. Back on the road, the refrigeration unit started making a strange, gurgling sound. I dismissed it as nothing, figuring the old thing was just acting up again. But then a new smell, sickly sweet and nauseating, started to seep into the cab. It smelled wrong, like rotting meat mixed with something almost floral. It was overpowering, clashing horribly with the dusty scent of the Texas landscape. I cracked a window, but the stench only intensified. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the endless ribbon of asphalt ahead, but the smell was relentless. It began to claw at the back of my throat, making me gag. Then, I heard it. A faint scratching, coming from the back. I pulled over to the side of the highway, heart hammering against my ribs. The scratching was louder now, accompanied by a soft, wet squelching sound. I grabbed my tire iron, my hand slick with sweat, and cautiously approached the back of the trailer. The gurgling from the refrigeration unit had become a frantic churning. I pressed my ear against the cold metal. The scratching and squelching sounds amplified. Something was definitely moving inside. Taking a deep breath, I flung open the trailer doors. The stench that hit me was almost unbearable, forcing me to stumble back, retching. The inside of the trailer was covered in a strange, yellowish fog. Through the haze, I could make out movement, a strange mass of something. As my eyes adjusted, the horrifying details started to emerge. The frozen chicken feet were no longer frozen. They were moving. Covered in a pulsating, glistening film, they were crawling over each other, squirming and growing. They weren't just chicken feet anymore. Bulbous, fleshy growths had erupted from them, transforming them into grotesque, multi-legged monstrosities. Their pale, fleshy bodies pulsed with a sickening rhythm, and from their tips, needle-like appendages flicked out, dripping a viscous, amber fluid. The creatures were multiplying rapidly, their numbers swelling before my eyes. They swarmed over each other, a seething mass of pulsating flesh and bone. The scratching sound I'd heard was the sound of their newly formed legs scraping against the metal floor of the trailer. The squelching was the sound of them crushing each other in their frantic growth. I slammed the doors shut, my mind reeling. I had to get away. I had to destroy this mobile nightmare I was hauling. But how? I ran back to the cab, fumbling for my phone. No signal. Just static. I pounded on the dashboard, a scream building in my throat. Then I remembered the dried peaches, the old woman. "For luck," she'd said. I snatched one from the passenger seat and examined it closely. There were faint, almost imperceptible veins crisscrossing its surface. They pulsed with the same sickly yellow light as the fog in the trailer. Suddenly, I understood. Those weren't peaches. They were seeds. Seeds of this nightmare. The scratching from the trailer intensified, the metal groaning under the pressure of the growing mass within. The truck began to rock gently, the creatures inside shifting their collective weight. I grabbed the tire iron and sprinted towards the front of the truck. I had to disable it. I had to stop it from moving. I swung the iron with all my might, smashing the headlights, then the grille. The truck lurched forward, the engine sputtering, but it didn't stop. The creatures inside were getting stronger. They were taking control. I scrambled back, the tire iron slipping from my grasp. The trailer doors burst open, the yellowish fog billowing out, revealing the grotesque cargo within. The chicken feet creatures, now the size of dogs, poured out of the trailer, their needle-like appendages dripping the amber fluid. I turned and ran, the sickening sweet smell filling my lungs, the scratching sound of their legs echoing in my ears. I ran until I collapsed, gasping for breath, in the middle of the empty highway. I looked back. The truck, now completely engulfed in the yellowish fog, was accelerating, heading straight for me. The grotesque creatures swarmed over the cab, their needle-like appendages waving in the air. The truck didn't slow down. It didn't swerve. It barreled towards me, a mobile nightmare, consuming everything in its path. The last thing I saw before the yellowish fog swallowed me whole were those pulsating fleshy growths, those needle-like appendages dripping their amber fluid. And I knew with a terrifying certainty that this was just the beginning. Story 22. The setting sun painted the cypress trees of Caddo Lake a sickly shade of orange. I pulled my rig off the main road, grateful for the quiet solitude. My gut rumbled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since that gas station breakfast burrito outside of Jefferson. I grabbed my cooler from the passenger seat, fished out a lukewarm Dr. Pepper, and headed down toward the water's edge. Caddo Lake wasn't your typical Texas lake. It was more of a sprawling swamp, choked with gnarled cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. The water black and still. It had a reputation. Local folks whispered about strange things. Missing persons, lights in the swamp, a feeling of being watched. I'd always dismissed it as backwoods superstition, but something about the stillness of the air, the almost complete silence broken only by the buzzing of unseen insects, made the hair on my arms stand up. I found a fallen log near the bank and sat down, popping open my Dr. Pepper. The sweetness was a welcome treat after hours of hauling frozen produce across the state. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the darkness deepened, swallowing the last vestiges of color. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to rise from the water, swirling around the bases of the cypress trees like restless spirits. Then I heard it. A low, croaky sound, like a giant's stomach rumbling. I initially dismissed it, thinking it might be some large animal in the woods. But the sound grew louder, closer, coming from the lake itself. I stood up, my heart beginning to pound in my chest. The fog was thicker now, limiting visibility to just a few feet. Straining my eyes, I saw something moving beneath the surface of the black water. Something large. The water rippled and churned, and the croaky sound intensified, becoming a deep, resonating growl. Whatever it was surfacing. The fog shifted, and I caught a glimpse of it. Something pale and fleshy, vast and undulating. It wasn't a fish, not anything I'd ever seen before. It was more like a giant, bloated slug, its skin slick and glistening in the dim light. And it was hungry. The creature rose further out of the water, revealing a gaping maw filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. The sickly sweet smell I'd noticed earlier intensified, now mixed with something distinctly metallic, the smell of blood. Terror rooted me to the spot. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I could only watch, horrified, as the creature moved closer, its huge, black eyes fixed on me. Then I saw them. Standing just beyond the creature, at the edge of the fog, were 3 figures. They were robed, their faces obscured by deep hoods. They stood motionless, their hands outstretched towards the creature, as if in supplication. The creature turned its attention back to the lake, its growl softening into a low gurgle. The water began to churn again, this time more violently. Something was happening beneath the surface. I heard a splash, followed by a desperate, gurgling cry. The cry was cut short. The churning subsided. The creature turned back towards me, its mouth dripping a dark, viscous fluid. The robed figures remained motionless, their silence more terrifying than any scream. I understood. This wasn't a random attack. This was an offering. The creature lunged towards me, its maw opening wide, revealing the full horror of its teeth. I stumbled backward, tripping over the log and falling to the ground. The Dr. Pepper slipped from my grasp, spilling its sticky sweetness onto the muddy bank. The last thing I saw before the creature reached me was the robed figures, their arms still outstretched, their silent witness to my demise. Then, everything went black. Story 23. The dispatcher had specifically warned me about it. Stay clear of Old Alton Bridge, he drawled, his voice crackling through the CB. Especially after dark. But I was behind schedule. Hauling a trailer full of antique porcelain dolls to a collector in Corpus Christi, and the old bridge, they said, shaved a good 30 minutes off the trip. 30 minutes I desperately needed. So, against my better judgment and the dispatcher's explicit instructions, I found myself rumbling toward the Goatman's Bridge just as twilight bled into night. The air, thick with the scent of cedar and something vaguely metallic, hung heavy and still. The bridge, a rickety wooden structure barely wider than my truck, loomed ahead, its dark silhouette a stark contrast to the bruised purple of the sky. As I approached, the silence, which had been almost comforting, became oppressive. The cicadas, which had been providing a relentless symphony just moments before, abruptly stopped. I gripped the steering wheel, a prickling unease crawling up my spine. Something wasn't right. Halfway across, I saw it. Not the Goatman himself, at first, but a single, withered sunflower lying in the exact center of the bridge. It looked strangely out of place on the weathered wooden planks. I slowed down, mesmerized by the peculiar sight. Then, from the shadows beneath the bridge, a voice spoke. Not a shout, not a whisper, but something in between, a raspy, almost mechanical sound that seemed to vibrate through the metal floor of my cab. Turn back, it said, the voice strangely melodic. This is not your path. I pressed the gas pedal. Logic told me it was just some local kids playing a prank, trying to scare unsuspecting travelers. But the deep, primal fear that gripped me screamed otherwise. The sunflower seemed to grow larger as I approached, its brown, desiccated head almost obscuring my view. As my front tires rolled over it, a deafening crack echoed through the night. The truck lurched violently, the trailer swinging precariously behind me. I slammed on the brakes, certain I'd blown a tire or worse. But when I cautiously stepped out to inspect the damage, everything seemed intact. The sunflower, however, was gone, vanished without a trace. In its place, a perfect circle about 3 feet in diameter had been carved into the wooden planks. The wood within the circle was smooth, almost polished, in stark contrast to the rough, weathered surface of the rest of the bridge. Then, the chanting started. Low and guttural, it seemed to emanate from the shadows beneath the bridge, growing steadily louder. And the circles. More of them appeared, spreading across the bridge like a horrifying rash. Each one perfectly formed, each one smooth and polished. They were spreading toward me, multiplying rapidly. Terror, cold and sharp, pierced through my fear. I scrambled back into the cab, heart pounding against my ribs. I tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The chanting intensified, becoming a horrifying chorus of unintelligible sounds. From the tree line beside the bridge, 3 figures emerged. They wore long, flowing robes that seemed to absorb the moonlight, making them appear as nothing more than moving shadows. In their hands, they carried something that glinted in the faint moonlight, long, curved blades, They moved with an unnerving fluidity, their forms seeming to glide across the bridge rather than walk. The circles on the bridge pulsed with a sickly yellow light, illuminating their approach. And then I saw it, held aloft by one of the figures, a single, withered sunflower, impossibly fresh. Its face turned towards me. It seemed to pulse with the same unnatural yellow light as the circles. They stopped just short of my truck, their faces still obscured by the shadows of their hoods. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and then, in unison, they raised their blades. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the sunflower, its face contorted into a horrifying rictus, the unnatural yellow light intensifying, becoming almost blinding. I woke up in a sterile white room, the smell of antiseptic sharp in my nostrils. A nurse bustled around me, her voice a soothing murmur. They told me I'd been found wandering along the highway near the bridge, disoriented and babbling. They'd found my truck abandoned, engine still running, parked haphazardly near the bridge. The trailer was empty, the porcelain dolls gone without a trace. I tried to tell them about the circles, the chanting, the figures with their blades and the sunflower, but the words wouldn't come. Or maybe I was just too afraid to speak them. They diagnosed me with exhaustion and dehydration, probably exacerbated by the sweltering Texas heat. They patted me on the back and sent me on my way. But I know what I saw, and I know what happened. And though I've driven 1,000,000 miles since that night, I still avoid Old Alton Bridge, and I still avoid anything remotely circular, especially sunflowers, because I know, with a terrible certainty, that the goatman and his sunflower are still out there waiting. Story 24. The flat, endless Texas landscape stretched before me, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and faded apricot. I was hauling a load of factory-made concrete gargoyles, destined for some McMansion in Midland. A strange cargo, sure, but the money was good. I'd been on the road for days, the monotony broken only by the occasional tumbleweed bouncing across the blacktop and the chirping of unseen insects. Somewhere around Junction, things started to get weird. I saw movement in my peripheral vision, flickering shapes at the edge of the headlight beams. Initially, I dismissed it as fatigue playing tricks on my eyes. But then I saw them more clearly, shadowy figures, tall and gaunt, loping alongside my truck with an unnerving grace. They weren't quite human. Their limbs were too long, their movements too jerky and fluid. And there was something about their stillness, a complete lack of life, that felt profoundly wrong. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but I could sense their attention focused on me, a palpable weight in the growing darkness. My unease morphed into full-blown fear as their numbers swelled. They were everywhere, flanking my truck, their silent presence radiating a chilling malice. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the vinyl sticking to my sweaty palms. I tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, exhaustion coupled with the isolation of the Texas plains. But the fear gnawing at my gut told me otherwise. I pressed the accelerator, the engine roaring in protest as I pushed my rig harder, desperately trying to outrun the shadows. But they kept pace, their forms distorting and shifting in my peripheral vision, their silent pursuit growing closer. Then I saw the circle, carved into the earth beside the road. It was almost perfectly symmetrical, the parched earth within a sickly shade of yellow. It was one of those unsettling circles I'd heard other drivers whisper about. Places where strange things happened, places best avoided. I tried to swerve, but it was too late. The front tires rolled across the edge of the circle, and that's when the whispers began. Not through the air, but inside my head. 1,000 malevolent voices murmuring in a primal language I couldn't understand, yet somehow knew. They whispered promises of power, of knowledge, of becoming something more. The whispers merged with the rhythmic thumping of my heart, growing steadily louder, becoming almost overpowering. An equal and opposite force, a terrifying intensity, compelled me to stop. to become part of whatever ritual was unfolding before me. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding across the asphalt, the tires screaming in protest. The whispering intensified, the voices blending into a horrifying chorus. The robed figures stopped, their forms silhouetted against the dying sunlight, their hands outstretched towards me. Panic clawed at my throat. I fumbled for my phone, but my hands were shaking uncontrollably. The screen illuminated my face, reflecting the terror in my eyes. I tried to dial 911, but the numbers on the keypad seemed to rearrange themselves, morphing into arcane glyphs I'd never seen before. The figures stepped closer, their robes swirling around them, their faces finally visible in the fading light. They weren't human. Their skin was stretched taut over bone, their eyes vacant black pools, reflecting the unnatural yellow light emanating from the circle. And their mouths were filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth, stained a disturbing shade of blood orange. They reached for me, their touch surprisingly gentle as they pulled me from the cab. I couldn't scream, couldn't fight, could only watch in horrified fascination as they led me towards the center of the circle. The ground beneath my feet felt strangely warm, almost alive. The whispers reached a fever pitch, the voices promising something terrible. The robed figures raised their hands, their fingers twitching, their needle-sharp teeth bared in grotesque smiles. And then, the earth split. A gaping chasm opened beneath me, revealing a churning black river, its surface swirling with an eerie luminescence. The sickly sweet smell of overripe peaches mixed with something distinctly metallic filled the air. I looked down into the abyss, the robed figures, faces etched into my memory. Their vacant smiles the last thing I saw before I plummeted into the fiery depths. The last I heard were the whispers, now a chilling lament, echoing up from the darkness, promising forever. Story 25. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in bruised purples and oranges, a landscape I'd seen 1,000 times in my years hauling refrigerated trailers. Tonight, though, something felt off. The air hung heavy, thick with a humid smell that evoked overripe fruit. I'd taken a shortcut, a little two-lane blacktop snaking through endless fields of sunflowers, promising quicker access to Corpus Christi. Now, I wished I'd stuck to the interstate. My GPS blinked out 30 miles back. Cell service vanished around the same time. I was relying on a tattered Texas travel brochure, its edges softened with age and tobacco juice, to navigate. It mentioned a rickety wooden bridge spanning the Nueces River somewhere around Junction. That bridge, I soon discovered, was gone. Collapsed years ago, according to a hand-painted sign nailed to a stunted mesquite. I swore under my breath. My delivery schedule was tight. Frozen chicken parts don't keep forever, especially in this sweltering Texas heat. I checked the brochure again, a growing unease settling in my gut. There was another route, barely marked, leading through something called Kincaid Ranch. Local folks whispered about Kincaid, I vaguely remembered. Strange things happened there. I pushed the thought aside. Superstitious nonsense. I swung the truck onto the barely discernible track, mesquite scraping against the cab. The track narrowed, barely wider than my rig, and the mesquite trees grew denser, crowding the road, their branches scratching against the metal. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and that sickly sweet smell intensified. It wasn't just overripe fruit anymore. There was something else mixed in, something almost floral, something distinctly metallic. Then I saw it. A single withered sunflower, lying inexplicably fresh in the middle of the track. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding across the loose gravel. The sunflower seemed to pulse, a faint, unnatural yellow light emanating from its center. I told myself it was fatigue, the desert playing tricks on my eyes. I was about to push the sunflower aside with my boot when I saw them. 3 robed figures stood before me, their faces obscured by deep hoods, their forms silhouetted against the dying light. They were completely still, their silence amplified by the chirping crickets. My heart hammered against my ribs. I tried the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. I was trapped. The figures moved closer, their movements jerky, almost mechanical. I fumbled for my CB radio, but static was the only response. They stopped a few feet away. The one in the center raised a hand, a long, skeletal finger pointing towards the sunflower. Then, with a fluid grace that belied their stiff posture, they moved aside, revealing a path leading into the thick undergrowth. Terror rooted me to my seat. I knew, with a terrible certainty, that if I followed that path, I wouldn't come back. But an equally powerful force compelled me forward. I grabbed a tire iron from under the seat, my knuckles white, and stepped out of the cab. The air hung heavy, the sweet smell almost overpowering. The figures remained motionless, their silent presence radiating a chilling malice. I followed the path, pushing through the dense vegetation, thorns tearing at my clothes. The path led to a clearing. In the center stood a rickety wooden structure, barely wider than a shed. A single flickering fluorescent light buzzed inside. The figures gestured towards the structure, their silent orders clear. I hesitated. Every screaming fiber of my being urged me to run, to turn back and somehow find my way out of this nightmare. But I couldn't. I had to see what was inside. I cautiously approached the structure, the tire iron clutched in my sweaty hand. The wooden planks of the walls seemed impossibly old, weathered and warped. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges groaning in protest. The light inside flickered, illuminating a scene that will forever be seared into my memory. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves sat rows of porcelain baby dolls. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, their vacant, painted eyes staring blankly ahead. In the center of the room, on a crude wooden altar, sat a single, unique doll. It was larger than the others, crafted from dark, almost black wood. Its eyes were not painted, but inlaid with what looked like polished obsidian. Around its neck hung a tarnished silver locket. As I stared at the doll, a voice spoke, raspy and ancient, seeming to come from the doll itself. "Welcome. We've been expecting you." The figures entered the shed, closing the door behind me. Their hoods fell back, revealing their faces. They were not human. Their skin was stretched tight over their skulls, revealing sharp teeth. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural yellow light. One of the figures, a woman with stringy blonde hair and a chillingly toothless smile, stepped forward and placed something in my hand. It was a small, leather pouch. Inside, nestled among dried herbs, lay a single, withered sunflower. "This," the woman said, her voice surprisingly melodic, "is for you. A token of our appreciation." Got then. With a speed that defied their age and stiff movements, they lunged. I remember screaming, the tire iron clattering to the floor. I remember the sharp, burning touch of their hands, the sickening sweet smell filling my nostrils, the horrifying rictus of their smiles. I remember nothing else. Story 26. The walnut pie at the Flying J was disappointingly dry. But the lukewarm coffee did its job. I was hauling a load of factory-made sheds to Corpus, a route I knew like the back of my hand. Junction was behind me, and the blacktop snaked ahead, an endless ribbon unspooling under my 18-wheeler's headlights. Around midnight I saw it, a clown car, on this desolate stretch of highway. My initial reaction was amusement. Who the hell drives a clown car at this hour? Then I realized it was gaining on me. Fast. For a clown car. It was still a good distance back, but its headlights were growing larger in my mirror, the unnatural yellow light intensifying. Unease prickled at the back of my neck. I tapped the accelerator, my rig roaring its disapproval. The clown car matched my speed increase, its headlights blazing like two malevolent eyes. My amusement turned to apprehension. This wasn't funny anymore. I hit 80, pushing my Peterbilt, and the clown car stuck with me like a leech. The hairs on my arms stood up. I'd driven these roads for years, seen my share of strange things, but this was different. I reached for my CB, but the damn thing was dead. Of course it was. Then the music started. A high-pitched, distorted calliope tune, tinny and off-key, coming from behind me. I glanced in my mirror. The clown car was right on my tail now, so close I could see the distorted, painted grins on the faces crowding the windows. Their eyes, wide and vacant, seemed to bore into me. Too many faces. Way too many for a car that size. Panic seized me. I slammed my foot down, the engine screaming in protest, the truck hurtling forward. The speedometer needle climbed past 90. The clown car didn't flinch. It stayed glued to my tail, the infernal calliope music growing louder, more distorted. Suddenly, a large, hairy arm shot out of the clown car's window. It held a watermelon. It hurled the melon at my truck. It exploded against my grill in a shower of red pulp and seeds. Another arm emerged, this one holding a bowling pin. It slammed against my windshield, spiderwebbing the glass. I swerved, barely avoiding a jackknifing trailer. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't a prank. This was an attack. More objects flew from the clown car. A rubber chicken, a giant inflatable hammer, a cream pie, all aimed at my truck, each impact accompanied by the crazed laughter of the clowns. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. I had to get away. I saw a turn-off ahead, a barely discernible track leading towards what looked like a dried-up river bed. It was a gamble, but any chance was better than this. I yanked the wheel. Tires screeching, the truck bucking as it left the highway and bounced along the rough track. The clown car followed without hesitation. Dust billowed behind us, limiting visibility. The track narrowed, becoming little more than a goat path, hemmed in by thick brush. I could feel the trailer swaying precariously behind me. I glanced in my mirror. The clown car, impossibly, was still right behind me, its headlights cutting through the dust cloud like malevolent searchlights. The music had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. Then, the track ended. Dead end. A sheer drop into the dry river yawned before me. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt inches from the edge. The clown car pulled up beside me, its occupant silent now. Their painted smiles somehow more menacing in the stillness. The driver's side window rolled down. A figure leaned out, its face obscured by shadow. It held out a small, brightly colored balloon animal. A twisted, grotesque parody of a dog. "Want a balloon, mister?" a voice, chillingly melodic, asked. I stared, frozen in terror. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The figure's hand holding the balloon animal stretched towards me. The hand was wrong. Too long, too thin. The fingers ended in sharp, pointed claws. Then, more figures emerged from the impossibly crowded car. They surrounded my truck, their painted faces now illuminated by the headlights, their grins stretching into horrifying rictuses. They carried strange, glinting instruments. Hooks, blades, saws. The figure with the balloon animal spoke again, its voice taking on a guttural, distorted quality. "We're going to have some fun, mister." I screamed, a wordless cry of pure terror, as they swarmed my truck, their laughter echoing through the night. A horrifying counterpoint to the scraping of metal against metal as they began to pry open my door. Story 27. The flickering neon sign of the Desert Rose Diner buzzed. A lonely beacon against the vast, star-speckled Texas sky. I pulled my rig in, my stomach growling louder than the engine after 12 hours hauling fertilizer. Inside, the air hung thick with the smell of stale coffee and frying bacon. I slid into a booth, the cracked vinyl sticking to my jeans. A figure shuffled in, his form obscured by the shadows clinging to the corners of the diner. He paused by my table, a thin, reedy voice asking, "Heated East friend?" He looked young, maybe 16, with stringy blonde hair and denim overalls. Harmless enough. "Corpus Christi." I grunted, already regretting the offer before it left my lips. "Hop in." The kid slid into the booth across from me. He didn't order anything, just stared out the window, his gaze fixed on the endless blacktop. Something about his stillness unnerved me. He didn't fidget, didn't blink. He just sat there, like a porcelain doll propped up in a dusty antique shop. We drove for hours, the silence broken only by the rumble of the tires and the occasional distant howl of a brush wolf. The kid never spoke, never moved. I tried making small talk, mentioning the Cowboys game. The price of diesel, the humidity, nothing. He just kept staring out the window, his reflection a pale ghost in the glass. Around midnight, I started feeling strange. A prickling sensation crawled across my skin, the air in the cab growing heavy, almost suffocating. The kid finally turned, his face now illuminated by the dashboard lights. His eyes, they weren't human. Large, black, and utterly devoid of any emotion. His mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. They weren't human teeth. He spoke, his voice a grating combination of a hiss and a whisper. "You know, I'm not from around here." Ah, panic clawed at my throat. My hand instinctively went for the gear shift, ready to slam on the brakes and throw this thing out of my truck. But I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind screaming. The kid giggled, a high-pitched, chilling sound. "Don't be afraid," he whispered, his voice dripping with a sickly sweet undertone. "The transformation is quite fascinating." And then it began. His skin rippled, his bones cracking and reforming. His limbs twisted at unnatural angles, elongating, becoming thin and spindly. His blonde hair fell out, replaced by a slick, oily membrane. His eyes bulged, turning a vibrant, unsettling yellow. His mouth split further, his jaw unhinging, revealing a second set of jaws within, filled with razor-sharp teeth. The smell god. The smell god. Like rotting meat mixed with overripe peaches filled the cab. The thing that had once been a boy was now a grotesque parody of human form. A spindly, multi-limbed horror with obsidian eyes and a gaping maw. It leaned closer, its breath hot and fetid against my face. "Beautiful, isn't it?" It hissed, its voice now a croaky growl. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for the inevitable. But instead of pain, I felt warmth. An unnatural warmth spreading through my veins, soothing, almost comforting. I opened my eyes. The creature was gone. The cab was empty, the smell of decay lingering in the air. I was alone. Shaking, I pulled over to the side of the road, desperate for fresh air. I stumbled out, gasping, trying to convince myself it had been a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stale coffee. But then I noticed the sunflower. A single, withered sunflower lying on the passenger seat. I had never seen a sunflower in my truck before. I picked it up, its petals brittle and dry, its center a dark, almost black, circle. The sickly sweet smell emanated from it, the same smell that had filled the cab moments before. I threw the sunflower out the window, my stomach churning. I got back in the truck and drove. Never looking back, never stopping until I reached Corpus Christi. I reported the incident to the police, of course. They listened patiently, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and pity. They searched my truck, but found nothing. No signs of a struggle, no trace of the creature. They suggested I was tired, stressed, maybe even hallucinating. I tried to tell them about the sunflower, but the words wouldn't come. They eventually let me go, chalking it up to a trucker's tall tale. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. And I know that I'm not crazy. I still drive, of course. I have to. But I never pick up hitchhikers anymore. And I still avoid anything remotely circular, especially sunflowers. Because every time I see one, I smell that sickly sweet scent. And I feel that unnatural warmth spreading through my veins. A constant reminder of the night I picked up the hitchhiking alien. And the terrifying certainty that the transformation isn't over. Story 28. The dispatcher said the Kincaid rig was thirsty. Needed mud, chemicals, drill bits, the usual cocktail to keep that black gold flowing. He also said it was a double-time job. A hefty bonus for anyone willing to brave the backroads out past Junction. Me, with bills piling up higher than a West Texas dust devil. I volunteered faster than a jackrabbit sprints from a wolf. The rig itself was a rusting monstrosity, perched like a skeletal iron bird on a patch of scrubland that looked like God's forgotten ashtray. The access road was a barely discernible track, rutted and choked with weeds. No welcoming committee, no security gate, just a bone-jarring ride that had my fillings rattling like dice in a cup. I pulled up beside the main platform, killed the engine, and the silence hit me like a slap. Not a peaceful silence, but a hollow, empty one, the kind that makes the hairs on your neck stand at attention. I climbed down, stretching my cramped legs, and a peculiar object caught my eye. Leaning against one of the reg's support legs was a child's toy, a bright yellow rubber duck, spotless and incongruous against the grime and rust. I figured some roughneck must have a kid, shrugged it off. Went looking for someone to sign the delivery papers. Nobody. I yelled, my voice swallowed by the vastness. Walked around the platform, peering into the crew quarters, the mess hall, the control room. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight filtering through grimy windows. Everything was abandoned. Tools lay scattered, half-eaten meals sat on tables, coffee cups still steaming. But no people. Just that unsettling silence, punctuated by the creak of metal and a faint, rhythmic thumping from deep within the rig. Then I heard it. Whispers. Faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves. Then growing steadily louder, weaving themselves into a chilling chorus. They seemed to emanate from the bowels of the rig, a susurrus of voices laced with an unnerving cadence. I tried to tell myself it was the wind whistling through the pipes, but a prickle of unease began to crawl up my spine. Following the sound, I descended a metal staircase that spiraled down into the rig's belly. The thumping grew louder, and the whispers intensified, morphing into a disturbing chant, words I couldn't quite decipher, but felt in the marrow of my bones. The air grew thick and heavy, and a sickly sweet smell, like overripe peaches and something faintly metallic, filled my nostrils. I reached the bottom level, a cavernous space dominated by the rig's massive drilling equipment. And there they were, 3 figures, robed in what looked like tattered burlap sacks, their faces obscured by deep hoods. They stood in a perfect circle around the central drill shaft, their hands outstretched, their bodies swaying in time with the rhythmic thumping. That thumping, I now realized, was coming from the drill itself, plunging relentlessly into the earth, despite the absence of any operator. As I watched, horrified, the figures lowered their hoods, revealing faces as pale and smooth as polished bone. Their eyes, large and black, fixed on the churning drill, glowed with an unnatural yellow light. They didn't seem to notice me. Their chanting intensified, reaching a fever pitch as the drill suddenly lurched, the rhythmic thumping replaced by a sickening grinding sound. The earth beneath me trembled. Fissures appeared in the concrete floor. The sickly sweet smell intensified, becoming almost overpowering, now definitely mixed with the metallic tang of blood. And the rubber duck. I saw it then, clutched in the skeletal hand of one of the figures. The rubber duck, an offering. The ground split open, a gaping chasm yawning before me, revealing the churning blackness below. The robed figures turned, their glowing eyes now fixed on me, their smiles stretching into horrifying rictuses. The chanting stopped. The whispers returned, now a chorus of 1,000 voices, urging me forward, promising something terrible. I stumbled backward, scrambling up the metal stairs, the whispers chasing me, the ground trembling beneath my feet. I burst out onto the platform, the desolate landscape suddenly a welcome sight. I leaped into my truck, fumbling with the keys, the image of the rubber duck seared into my mind. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the truck into gear, tires spitting gravel as I tore away from that cursed place. The whispers fading behind me, but their chilling echo forever etched in my soul. I never looked back, but I knew, with a terrible certainty, that they were still there, continuing their horrifying ritual around that churning drill, waiting for the next offering, the next Saul lured by the promise of double-time pay. I drive still, But I stay far from the back roads, far from anything remotely resembling an oil rig, and I definitely stay away from anything at all, that reminds me of a rubber duck. Story 29. The dispatcher had specifically warned me about Kincaid Ranch. "Just skip it, Ricky," she'd said, her voice raspy with late-night wariness. "Ain't worth the $20. Strange things happen around there." I'd chuckled, dismissing it as backwoods superstition. $20 was $20. I needed every penny. The first sighting happened outside of Ozona. I'd pulled over for a bathroom break, the blacktop snaking through endless fields of stunted mesquite. A flicker of movement caught my eye. Across the highway, in a small clearing, 3 robed figures stood around something, low to the ground. Even from that distance, the sight prickled my unease. I couldn't make out any details, but the scene felt wrong. I quickly finished my business and climbed back into my Peterbilt, the image lingering. The second sighting happened a few hours later, closer to Junction. A withered sunflower lay in the middle of the road. Odd, considering the lack of sunflowers anywhere nearby. As I slowed, 3 robed figures materialized from the sparse mesquite, their faces obscured by deep hoods. They simply stood there, watching me, their silent presence radiating an unnerving energy. I floored it, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The third sighting happened just as I reached the turnoff for Kincaid Ranch. This time, it was a single, flickering fluorescent light buzzing inside a rickety wooden structure barely wider than my truck. Drawn by a morbid curiosity, and that $20, I cautiously swung onto the dirt track. The robed figures were there, waiting. They didn't speak, but their silence amplified the unsettling feeling that had been gnawing at me. They gestured towards the structure. Inside, illuminated by that single, sickly yellow bulb, lay a cow. Not dead, but altered. Its eyes were gone, replaced by perfect circles of smooth, almost polished, obsidian. Its flesh was unnaturally taut, utterly devoid of blood. A chilling chant started, low and guttural, coming from the robed figures. My stomach lurched. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. This was ritualistic. Suddenly, a fourth figure emerged from the darkness. I assumed it was a he, though his form was obscured by a thick, faded velvet robe, carried a long, curved blade. It glinted in the flickering light. He moved towards the cow, the chanting intensifying. I knew I should leave. Every screaming fiber of my being urged me to run, but some equally powerful force compelled me to stay. I was trapped, a silent witness to something ancient and horrifying. The blade flashed. A scream, not from the cow, but from something else, something inhuman, echoed through the small structure. The ground trembled. The sickly sweet smell that I'd noticed earlier intensified, becoming almost overpowering. I gagged, bile rising in my throat. The chanting stopped. The figure with the blade turned, his face finally visible beneath his hood. His eyes were the same obsidian black as the cow's. His smile stretched wide, revealing rows of impossibly sharp teeth. He pointed the blade at me. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, the truck roaring back to life. I barreled through the wooden structure, the robed figures scattering. The truck bucked and swayed as I careened down the rough track, the chilling chant echoing behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, my heart hammering against my ribs, my hands slick with sweat. I reported the incident to the local sheriff. He listened patiently, a skeptical frown etched on his face. He promised to investigate, but I could tell he dismissed it as the ramblings of a tired trucker. He probably wasn't wrong. What proof did I have? Who would believe me? But I knew what I saw. I haven't hauled anything near Kincaid Ranch since. I still drive these Texas roads, but I avoid anything remotely resembling a shortcut, especially if it involves a dirt track and a flickering light. And I still avoid cherry pie. The smell evokes that sickly sweet scent that filled that small wooden structure, the scent that forever stained my memory. Because every so often, when I'm alone on the highway, late at night, With the endless Texas landscape stretching before me, I see them in my rearview mirror. 3 robed figures, their faces obscured, their silent pursuit growing closer. And I know, with a terrible certainty, that they're still there, continuing their horrifying ritual around that chillingly toothless smile. Story 30. The dream catcher hung from my rearview mirror, its intricate web shimmering in the Texas sun. $20 from a roadside vendor seemed a small price for a good night's sleep. I'd been restless, plagued by weird, vivid dreams that left me drained. Little did I know, sleep was about to become my worst enemy. That first night, the dream started normally enough. I was back home in Abilene, grilling steaks for my wife, Darla. The aroma of mesquite charcoal filled the air, the kids laughing in the background. Then, the laughter twisted into a chilling chant. The steaks blackened, charring into something unrecognizable. Darla's face melted, her features shifting, becoming something else. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart hammering. Dismissed it as just a bad dream. But the next night, it returned. Same setting, same chant, but this time, 3 robed figures emerged from the mesquite trees behind my house, their faces obscured by deep hoods. Night after night, the dream repeated, each time growing more disturbing. The robed figures grew closer, their chant louder. A sickeningly sweet smell, like overripe fruit mixed with something metallic, began to permeate the dream. I tried sleeping without the dream catcher, tried different sleeping pills, even tried staying awake all night. Nothing worked. The dream, or rather, the nightmare, always returned. The details of the dream began bleeding into my waking hours. I started seeing shadows where there were none, hearing whispers in the quiet hum of my rig. The sweet, metallic smell would sometimes waft up from my air vents, triggering waves of nausea. I began to dread nightfall, knowing what awaited me. One night, in the dream, I found myself no longer in my backyard, but standing on a desolate stretch of Texas highway. The same 3 robed figures stood before me, their chant now a gravelly, almost primal language. I tried to run, but my legs were lead. The figures raised their hands, and the ground beneath me split open, revealing a churning vortex of blackness. Then, I saw it. In the center of the swirling darkness, a single withered sunflower, its petals brittle and brown. I woke up gasping for air, the image seared into my mind. The next day, hauling a load of electronics to El Paso, I saw it again. A single withered sunflower lying on the shoulder of Highway 80, just outside of Odessa. I almost swerved off the road, a jolt of pure terror coursing through me. This wasn't just a dream anymore. I pulled over, heart pounding, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe the lack of sleep was making me hallucinate. But deep down, a terrifying certainty settled in. The nightmare was becoming real. That night, the dream shifted again. I was back on the highway, the chasm yawning before me. The robed figures gestured towards the darkness, their silent orders clear. I looked down and saw myself holding a leather pouch, its contents squirming beneath the surface. I knew, with chilling clarity, what I had to do. I spent the next 2 days frantically searching for information about the dream, about the sunflower, about anything that could explain what was happening to me. I scoured local legends, Native American folklore, anything related to dream catchers and nightmares. Finally, in a dusty, forgotten corner of a small town library, I found it. A tattered, yellowed newspaper clipping detailing the disappearance of 3 siblings 15 years prior. They had vanished near Junction, Texas, their truck abandoned near a remote stretch of the Nueces River. The article mentioned a strange detail. A single withered sunflower found clutched in the hand of the youngest sibling. Below the article, someone had scrawled in faded ink, "The Dreamcatcher's tall." My blood ran cold. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that the Dreamcatcher wasn't protecting me from nightmares. It was feeding them. It was a conduit, a trap set by a malevolent entity. And I was its next victim. The final night, the dream took me back to the highway, the chasm now a raging inferno. The robed figures were chanting, their voices merging into a deafening chorus. I held the leather pouch, its contents now pulsing with a sickening warmth. Inside, I knew, were the stolen souls of the missing siblings. The dream catchers tall. The figures gestured again, their silent command echoing in my mind. Throw it in. Complete the circle. A wave of defiance surged through me. I wouldn't become another victim. I would break free from this nightmare, even if it killed me. With a primal scream, I hurled the pouch, not into the inferno, but at the robed figures. The dream shattered. I woke up in my truck, parked at a rest stop outside of El Paso. The dream catcher was gone, vanished. The sweet, metallic smell lingered faintly in the air, a chilling reminder of the terror I had endured. I haven't dreamt since. But sometimes, when I drive through the quiet stretches of Texas highway, especially near Junction, I see a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. A flash of robed figures, their faces obscured, and a single, withered sunflower lying on the roadside. And I know with a chilling certainty that the dreamcatcher's nightmare hasn't ended. It's just waiting for its next victim. Story 31. The endless Texas blacktop stretched ahead, shimmering under the relentless sun. My eyelids felt heavy, the miles blurring together. I'd been hauling double-decker trailers of factory-made sunrooms across the state for weeks, and exhaustion gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. Just outside of Del Rio, I saw a hand-painted sign advertising "World's Best Pumpkin Pie, Next Exit." My stomach growled in agreement. A slice of pie and strong coffee sounded like heaven. The diner was a typical roadside affair: vinyl booths, faded posters, and the lingering aroma of fried food. A lone figure sat at the counter, his back to me. He wore a worn denim jacket and a trucker hat pulled low over his eyes. I slid into the booth opposite him. "Coffee, black," I told the waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Darla. "You new around these parts?" Darla asked, pouring my coffee. Her voice was surprisingly melodic. "Just passing through," I replied, stifling a yawn. "Lots of strange things happen on these roads," Darla said, her voice lowering. "Especially around here," I chuckled. "Oh, yeah, like what?" The figure at the counter slowly turned. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could see a strange glint in his eyes. "Hypnosis," he said, his voice a low, almost hypnotic drone. I laughed nervously. "Hypnosis? Is that so?" "It's a gift," the man said, his gaze unwavering. "And a curse." Suddenly, I felt a strange pressure in my head, a dull pain behind my eyes. The diner seemed to spin, the clatter of plates and cutlery becoming a distant hum. The man's voice, now surprisingly close to my ear, seemed to wrap around me, pulling me under. "You're tired," he murmured. "So tired. You just want to rest, sleep." My eyelids fluttered. I struggled to focus, to fight the overwhelming urge to close my eyes. But the man's voice, smooth and insistent, continued its relentless assault. "You're driving to El Paso," he said, "delivering those sunrooms. But you're going to take a detour, a shortcut. I'll show you the way." I tried to shake my head, to protest. But my body felt leaden, my will dissolving. The man's words became commands. My own thoughts replaced by his suggestions. I remember leaving the diner, a strange sense of detachment washing over me. I remember driving, the world outside my truck seeming oddly unreal. The miles passing in a blur. I remember the man's voice, a constant presence in my mind, guiding me, controlling me. He told me to pull off the highway, onto a dirt road barely wide enough for my truck. He told me to drive deeper into the desolate landscape, past abandoned farms and crumbling windmills. He told me to stop at a small, dilapidated shack hidden amongst a thicket of mesquite trees. Inside the shack, the air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. The walls were covered in strange symbols, crudely drawn in charcoal. In the center of the room, a single flickering candle illuminated a rough wooden table. On the table lay a tarnished silver pocket watch, its hands frozen at 3 in the morning. The man's voice urged me forward. "Pick it up," he whispered. "Hold it. Look at it." My hand, no longer my own, reached out and grasped the watch. The metal felt cold against my skin. As I stared at the watch face, the numbers began to swirl, the hand spinning wildly. The pressure in my head intensified, a stabbing pain. Then, darkness. I woke up strapped to a metal table, the cold steel biting into my flesh. The shack was gone, replaced by a sterile white room. Bright fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The man stood beside me, his face now clearly visible. He was older than I'd initially thought, his features sharp and angular, his eyes filled with a chillingly calm intensity. He held a scalpel, its blade glinting under the harsh light. "Welcome," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You're my latest project." He leaned closer, his breath warm against my ear. "You see," he whispered, "I'm building something beautiful, and you're going to be a part of it." He raised the scalpel, his hand steady. I screamed, a primal, wordless shriek of terror. But my voice was swallowed by the sterile white walls, lost in the chilling silence of the room. Then, the scalpel descended, and the world exploded into blinding, agonizing pain. The next few days are a blur of fragmented memories. I remember the searing pain, the metallic tang of blood, the man's detached, clinical observations. I remember the strange instruments, the whirring drills, the sickening crunch of bone. I remember the chilling realization that I was becoming something else, something monstrous. Then, another blank space, a void where memories should be. I woke up in a hospital bed, bandaged and disoriented. A nurse bustled around me, her face a mask of professional concern. "You were found wandering along the highway," she explained. "You were confused. Do you remember anything?" I tried to speak, to tell her what had happened, about the man, the shack, the horrifying transformation, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt constricted, my voice trapped somewhere deep inside. The nurse smiled gently. "It's all right," she said. "You're safe now. Safe." But the man's voice still echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of the horrors I'd endured. And as I looked down at my bandaged hands, I saw a faint, unsettling glint of metal beneath the gauze. A tarnished silver glint, the glint of a pocket watch's hands forever frozen at 3 o'clock. Story 32. The coffee was weak, lukewarm, and tasted faintly of burnt rubber. But when hauling frozen pizzas across the desolate expanse of West Texas, you don't get picky. Junction jolt. Read the chipped mug. I needed a jolt, all right. The endless blacktop was blurring, the center lines morphing into squirming snakes at the edges of my vision. This particular truck stop was a relic, tucked away like a forgotten secret off a barely marked access road. One flickering fluorescent light buzzed inside, illuminating faded posters advertising long-gone brands of cigarettes and motor oil. The counter woman, a woman with a name tag that read, Darlene, eyed me with a disturbing lack of curiosity as she poured the questionable brew. 35 cents. I paid, thinking it a small price for a potential lifeline. The first sip didn't wake me up, but something else happened. A tingling sensation, not unpleasant, started at the base of my skull and spread down my spine. The world outside, through the grimy window, took on a sharper focus. Colors vibrated. The cracked asphalt shimmered under the solitary light. Even the rusted-out pickup truck, parked haphazardly outside, seemed interesting. The second sip brought sound. Not the usual din of a truck stop. The clatter of cutlery. The rumble of idling engines. This was different. A low, humming drone, almost melodic, but unsettling in its consistency. It seemed to emanate from the very walls of the place. By the third sip, the humming intensified, and with it came movement. Darlene, who had been polishing the counter with a disturbingly slow, circular motion, stopped. Her head snapped up, her eyes, previously dull, now gleaming with an unnatural light. She smiled, a slow, deliberate stretching of her lips that revealed far too much gum and too few teeth. "You like the coffee?" she asked, her voice surprisingly melodic. I nodded, unsure how to respond. "Good," she said, her smile widening. "It's a special blend." Then, her eyes flicked to something behind me. The humming increased in volume, taking on a rhythmic, almost hypnotic quality. I turned, expecting to see another wary traveler, a late-night trucker seeking caffeine and solace. But the booths were empty. Except, in the furthest corner, covered in shadows, 3 figures sat motionless. They wore dark robes, their faces obscured by deep hoods. They were perfectly still, yet I could feel their attention focused on me with laser-like intensity. The humming now felt like a physical vibration, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. Darlene chuckled, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her. "They're waiting for you," she whispered. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but sit there, transfixed by the 3 figures in the corner. But my limbs felt heavy, my muscles unresponsive. The coffee, the special blend, had taken hold. The figures rose, their movements slow and deliberate, almost mechanical. They began to chant, a low, croaky drone that blended with the humming, creating a horrifying symphony of sound. The words were unintelligible, yet somehow I understood. They were speaking of circles, perfect circles. My gaze was drawn back to Darlene, who now held a small, tarnished silver locket in her hand. It swung back and forth, a hypnotic pendulum against the backdrop of the chanting figures. The locket, I realized, was not swinging randomly. It was tracing a circle on the counter. A perfect circle. Terror, pure and cold, finally broke through the haze. I lurched to my feet, knocking over the mug. The junction jolt splattered across the linoleum, the dark liquid spreading outwards, forming a perfect circle. The chanting intensified. The figures moved closer, their robes swirling around them. Darlene's smile stretched into a grotesque rictus, her eyes burning with an unholy light. "The circles must be closed," she hissed. I stumbled backwards, desperate to escape, but the door seemed miles away. The figures closed in, their chant now deafening. Their movements no longer slow and deliberate, but swift and predatory. They raised their hands, their fingers long and skeletal, reaching for me. And then, I saw it. Carved into the counter, beneath the spreading circle of coffee, was another circle, and another, and another. Dozens of them, overlapping, interconnected, forming a grotesque tapestry of perfect circles. I understood then. This wasn't just a truck stop, it was a shrine, a place of ritual. And I, the unwitting recipient of the special blend, was the sacrifice. The figures were upon me, their hands grasping, their chant reaching a fever pitch. The last thing I saw, before the darkness consumed me, was Darlene's triumphant smile and the perfect circle formed by the blood blooming on my shirt. Story 33. The sunflower. It started with the sunflower. Lying there, brittle and brown, amidst the gravel and grit, a single withered sunflower. It seemed to stare, accusing. A silent witness to something I couldn't quite grasp. That's all I remember before the screaming, before the metal shrieked and the world twisted. I'd picked her up outside Del Rio, a sliver of a thing in a faded apricot dress, clutching a worn leather pouch. Stringy blonde hair framed a face that seemed both ancient and innocent. She didn't speak at first, just offered a shy smile and a nod. I figured she was headed east, maybe to San Antonio, someplace bigger than this dusty border town. "Junction," she finally rasped, her voice surprisingly melodic. "Can you take me to Junction?" Junction was a bit out of my way, but I had time. Plus, there was something about her, a fragility that tugged at something protective within me. I nodded, she climbed in, and we rumbled off into the deepening twilight. We drove for a while, the only sounds the hum of the tires and the distant drone of cicadas. The Texas landscape unfolded before us, a vast, desolate expanse of scrub brush and stunted mesquite. I tried making small talk, asking about her family, her destination, anything to break the oppressive silence. She answered in monosyllables, her gaze fixed on something just beyond the horizon. Then, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Beware the circles. They promise much but take more. Avoid the circles." I chuckled nervously. Circles. What's crop circles? Like aliens. Like her eyes. Unsettlingly clear and blue, met mine. Not those circles. Different circles. They offer a shorter path, but they lead to somewhere you don't want to go. She clutched the leather pouch tighter. Stay away from the circles. I dismissed it as backwoods superstition. The kind of thing you heard whispered in dusty truck stops. I'd hauled 1,000,000 miles across Texas and seen my share of strange things, but circles seemed harmless enough. Miles later, just outside Sonora, I spotted it. A barely discernible track leading off the main highway, almost hidden amongst the thick vegetation. It was a shortcut, I realized. One that could shave a good 30 minutes off my drive. And there, carved into the parched earth at the entrance to the track, was a perfect circle. My passenger's words echoed in my ears. Beware the circles. I hesitated, a prickle of unease crawling across my skin. Logic told me it was just a coincidence, a random shortcut, nothing more. But the sunflower, that withered, accusing sunflower, flashed through my mind. Against my better judgment, I swung the truck onto the track. The road was rough, barely wider than my truck, the mesquite scraping against the sides of the trailer. The air grew thick, heavy with a cloying sweetness that evoked overripe fruit. The further I drove, the more oppressive the silence became. Every rustle of leaves, every chirp of a cricket sent jolts of unease through me. Then, I saw them. 3 robed figures, standing motionless in the center of another. Larger circle carved into the earth. Their faces were obscured by deep hoods, their forms seeming to shimmer in the fading light. The sickly sweet smell intensified, almost overpowering. My passenger's warning screamed in my mind. I slammed on the brakes, the tires spitting gravel. But it was too late. The figures raised their hands, their movements jerky and unnatural. A croaky chant started, low and rhythmic, vibrating through the truck itself. The air crackled with an unseen energy. My passenger beside me was gone. Vanished. Just like that. The chanting intensified, the figures closing in. I tried to put the truck in reverse, but the engine sputtered, dying. I was trapped. The world seemed to twist, the ground beneath me trembling. Cracks appeared in the asphalt, spreading outwards in a perfect circle. The sickly sweet smell became almost unbearable. The robed figures reached the truck, their faces finally visible beneath their hoods. They weren't human. Not anymore. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural yellow light, their smiles stretched into grotesque rictuses, revealing rows of impossibly sharp teeth. That's when the screaming started, my screaming. Then, nothing. Just the sunflower. Lying there, brittle and brown, a silent witness. The sunflower, and the circles, they promised much but took more. Story 34. The flat, endless Texas landscape stretched before me, the setting sun painting the sky a bruised purple. I'd been hauling fabricated sunrooms towards Corpus Christi, a welcome change from the usual livestock. The miles blurred together, the monotony broken only by the occasional tumbleweed bouncing across the blacktop. Somewhere around Junction, I took a random shortcut, a barely discernible track snaking through thick scrub brush. I figured it'd shave 30 minutes off my drive, a small price to pay for an early night. Bad decision. The track narrowed, barely wider than my rig. The scrub brush became thicker vegetation, the mesquite crowding in, their branches scratching against the trailer. An unsettling silence fell, broken only by the crunch of tires on loose gravel. My headlights cut through the deepening gloom, illuminating a faded wooden sign, Kincaid Ranch. I'd heard whispers about Kincaid Ranch, stories whispered by other drivers at dusty truck stops, tales of strange things happening there. I should have turned back, but some equal yet opposite force compelled me forward. The track twisted and turned, the vegetation becoming almost impenetrable. Then, I saw them. 3 robed figures stood in the middle of the track, their forms silhouetted against the last sliver of dying sunlight. My tires screeched as I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding across the loose gravel. I almost hit them. They didn't move. I leaned out the window, my heart hammering. "You were right there," I called out. No response. Just an unnerving stillness. They didn't even seem to breathe. I considered turning around, but the track behind me seemed to have vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of thorny brush. Trapped. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice shaking. "Just let me pass." The figures remained motionless. Then, slowly, they raised their hands, their movements jerky, almost mechanical. Their hands, they weren't hands. They were claws, long, pointed claws, and their faces, finally visible beneath their hoods, were sharp, almost skeletal, with vacant black pools reflecting the fading light. A croaky murmur started, a low, rhythmic drone that vibrated through the truck. It grew louder, becoming a chant. A chilling chorus in some primal language I'd never heard, yet somehow understood. The robed figures began to circle the truck, their chant echoing through the growing darkness. My palms became slick with sweat, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that I was witnessing something I was never meant to see. The chant intensified, the ground trembling beneath the truck. Fissures appeared in the earth beside the tires, widening, deepening. A sickeningly sweet smell filled the air, like overripe fruit mixed with something faintly metallic. I slammed my foot on the gas, the engine roaring, but the truck wouldn't budge. It was as if it were rooted to the spot. The earth beside the truck split further, revealing a gaping chasm, a churning vortex of blackness. The robed figures continued their chant, their forms flickering, distorting, becoming something other. Their smiles stretched, becoming grotesque rictuses, their obsidian faces gleaming in the unnatural yellow light emanating from the chasm. I knew, with a horrifying understanding, what was about to happen. This was no ordinary road. This was a place where reality twisted, a place where the veil between worlds thinned, a place where ancient, forgotten rituals were still performed, and I, a tired trucker seeking a shortcut, had unwittingly become their next offering. The truck tilted precariously, the front tires dangling over the edge of the abyss. The chanting reached a fever pitch, the ground shaking violently. I screamed, a wordless shriek of terror, but the sound was swallowed by the horrifying chorus. Then, with a sickening lurch, the truck plunged into the darkness. I remember falling, the truck spinning, the chanting echoing all around me. I remember the sickeningly sweet smell, the unnatural yellow light, and the horrifying faces of the robed figures peering down at me from the rim of the chasm. Then, nothing. I woke up in a sterile white room, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. A nurse bustled around, her face etched with professional concern. She asked me questions I couldn't answer. Questions about where I'd been, what I'd seen. I tried to tell her about the robed figures, the chasm, the chanting, but the words wouldn't come. They were trapped somewhere inside me, along with the horrifying truth of what had happened on Kincaid Ranch. I've been here for months now. The doctors talk about traumatic stress, about induced hallucinations. They don't believe me. But I know what I saw, and I know that I'll never forget the night I stumbled upon that forgotten corner of Texas, the night I became another victim of the time-traveling truck. I still see those robed figures, their vacant smiles, their pointed claws, in my dreams. And I still hear that chilling chant, echoing through the quiet stretches between towns. A constant reminder of the horrifying truth hidden beneath the surface of the Texas landscape. They're still out there waiting. And one day, the road will call again. Story 35. The Flat. Monotonous Texas landscape stretched ahead, blurring into the growing twilight. My eyelids felt heavy, gritty from another all-nighter hauling factory-made sheds from El Paso. Just outside Ozona, a flicker of lightning split the sky, followed by a low rumble that promised something worse. I pulled off the 2-lane blacktop onto a barely discernible dirt track, figuring any shelter was better than none. The track snaked through dense, thorny brush, the truck bouncing violently with every rut and pothole. I squinted, trying to make out something, anything, resembling a building through the downpour. Then, I saw it, a dim, flickering light, seemingly miles away. Hope surged through me, maybe an old farmhouse offering a warm bed and a hot meal. I pushed the accelerator, the truck groaning in protest as it lurched forward. As I drew closer, the light resolved into a flickering fluorescent bulb buzzing inside a small, squat structure built into the side of a hill. It looked less like a farmhouse and more like a mine entrance. Abandoned, judging by the rusting metal supports and the collapsed section of the roof. Well, a mine was better than nothing. I pulled up as close as I could and killed the engine. The silence that followed was almost complete, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water from the damaged roof. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously stepped out. The metal door to the mine was ajar, creaking rhythmically in the wind. The buzzing fluorescent light illuminated a tunnel leading into darkness. A faint, sweet smell emanated from within, like overripe plums mixed with something metallic. A shiver ran down my spine. I hesitated, a sudden, inexplicable unease gnawing at me. But the storm was raging, and I was exhausted. Telling myself it was just the storm, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The buzzing of the light was the only sound, amplifying the cavernous silence. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls and a muddy floor. The air was thick with the cloying sweet smell, stronger now and colder. The tunnel sloped downwards, disappearing into the black depths of the earth. I took a tentative step forward, then another. The dripping water echoed strangely, the sound magnified by the confined space. After a few minutes, the tunnel opened into a large cavern. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting eerie shadows across the walls. And that's when I saw them. 3 figures stood in the center of the cavern, robed and hooded, their backs to me. They were motionless, eerily still. The sweet, metallic smell was overpowering here. I could almost taste it. Hello. I called out, my voice echoing through the cavern. The figures didn't move. My heart began to pound. Something felt terribly wrong. Hello. I repeated louder this time. Slowly, almost mechanically, the figures turned. The light caught the edges of their faces, revealing nothing. Their hoods obscured their features completely, but I could feel their gazes, cold and intense, fixed on me. They began to chant. Loud, guttural sounds that resonated deep within my chest, vibrating through my bones. The sound seemed to fill the cavern, growing louder, more intense. Fear, cold and sharp, glowed at me. I backed away, stumbling over a loose rock. My flashlight beam danced wildly across the walls, illuminating something on the floor. It was a circle. A perfect circle carved into the rock. Inside the circle, something glinted in the flickering light. I pointed my flashlight closer. It was a knife. A long, curved blade, stained dark. And surrounding the knife, arranged in a precise pattern, were teeth. Human teeth. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The chanting intensified, the gravelly sounds twisting into a chillingly melodic drone. The robed figures began to move closer, their movements slow, deliberate, almost hypnotic. My breath caught in my throat. I scrambled back, desperately trying to put some distance between myself and the chanting figures. But the cavern walls seemed to close in around me, the air thick with the sweet, metallic smell. Suddenly, I understood. This wasn't just an abandoned mine. It was something far more sinister. A place of ritual, of sacrifice. And I was the next offering. They were closing in, their chant reaching a fever pitch. I turned and ran, my boots slipping in the mud. The horrific drone echoing in my ears. The tunnel seemed endless, stretching into the darkness, the buzzing fluorescent light a mocking beacon, leading me deeper into the earth. I could hear them behind me, their chant growing louder, their footsteps echoing through the tunnel, their presence radiating a chilling malice. I knew, with a terrible certainty, that I would never escape. This abandoned mine, this place of forgotten rituals, would become my tomb. The sweet, metallic smell would be the last thing I ever smelled. And those robed figures, those faceless guardians of this horrifying secret, would continue their chant, their ritual uninterrupted, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to stumble upon their abandoned mine and become their next offering. Story 36. The wind howled, a mournful, bone-chilling sound that sliced through the insulated walls of my cab. West Texas in December was a fickle mistress. Sunshine one minute, blizzard the next. This blizzard, though, felt different. Heavier, more malevolent. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles bone white, peering through the swirling white chaos. Visibility was down to about a foot. I should have stopped hours ago, but that bonus for an on-time delivery to Corpus Christi kept whispering in my ear. That's when I heard it. Over the wind, a sound that made my blood run cold. A high-pitched, almost ululating wail that seemed to claw at the very edges of sanity. The Wendigo. My grandpappy used to tell stories about it, a malevolent spirit born of desperation and cannibalism. Forever cursed to roam the frozen wastes, eternally hungry. He'd told me those stories to scare me straight, keep me from becoming another forgotten soul swallowed by the vast, unforgiving Texan landscape. I pulled over, the tires protesting against the sudden stop, the rhythmic thumping of my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The wail came again, closer this time, followed by a chilling, almost melodic drone. I frantically searched the glove compartment for something, anything, that could offer protection. A Steve Christopher medal. A rabbit's foot. My fingers closed around something smooth and cold. A painted ceramic armadillo a souvenir Darla had bought me from some roadside tourist trap. It was ridiculous, I knew, but I clutched it like a lifeline. The droning intensified, the wind seeming to whip around my truck with renewed fury, the painted ceramic vibrating in my hand. Then, through the swirling snow, I saw them. 3 figures, robed in something that shimmered like ice, their faces obscured by deep hoods. They stood in a perfect circle around a swirling vortex of blackness that seemed to suck the very light from the world. The melodic drone reached a fever pitch, and then, from the blackness, another sound emerged, a sickening, guttural growl that promised pain and hunger, and something far worse than death. The figures raised their hands, their movements jerky and unnatural, and the wind howled louder, as if in response. The vortex pulsed, and the growl intensified. The armadillo in my hand grew unbearably hot, the paint seeming to melt beneath my fingers. I screamed, a wordless shriek of pure terror, throwing the armadillo towards the figures. It hit the ground before them, shattering against the frozen earth, and the world exploded. The vortex expanded, swallowing the figures, the truck, the very ground beneath me. I was falling, plummeting into an endless abyss of swirling black and icy cold, the gravelly growl echoing all around me. The last thing I saw, before the darkness consumed me entirely, was a single, withered sunflower lying inexplicably fresh amidst the snow at the very edge of the abyss. I woke up in a sterile white room, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the air. A nurse bustled around, her face a blur of concerned professionalism. I tried to speak, to tell her about the figures, the vortex, the never-ending hunger. But the words wouldn't come. I looked down at my hands, expecting to see burns from the molten armadillo, but they were clean, unblemished. "You're safe now," the nurse murmured, her voice surprisingly gentle. "You were found wandering along Highway 87, just outside of Sonora. You've been through quite an ordeal." I tried to shake my head, to tell her it was more than an ordeal. It was a glimpse into something far more terrifying, but my body wouldn't respond. She smiled, a reassuring, professional smile, and handed me a small paper cup filled with water. "Drink this," she said. "It'll help." I took the cup, my hands shaking, and brought it to my lips. The water tasted faintly of peaches, overripe peaches. A shiver ran down my spine, and the melodic drone echoed faintly in my ears. "The doctor will be in to see you shortly," the nurse said, her voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. "He'll want to ask you some questions." "Questions about what?" "About the Wendigo. About the vortex. About the sunflower." I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I could never tell them the truth. No one would believe me. They'd think I was crazy. But as the nurse turned to leave, a peculiar detail caught my eye. Pinned to her crisp white uniform, almost hidden amongst the folds of fabric, was a small, painted ceramic armadillo, identical to the one I'd thrown into the abyss. And beneath the cheerful, cartoonish grin of the armadillo, I could just make out a single, withered sunflower, painted in a disturbing shade of yellow. I closed my eyes, the croaky growl echoing in my mind, and a terrifying truth settled upon me. I wasn't safe. I would never be safe. I was marked, and the Wendigo's hunger was far from sated. Story 37. I've always had a knack for mimicking voices. My mama used to say I could parrot a mockingbird before I could even walk. It's a useless talent, mostly entertaining drunk folks at truck stops, but it paid for a few beers and a couple tanks of diesel over the years. So, when I heard that distinct Texas drawl crackle over the CB, asking about the best barbecue joint in Waco, I couldn't resist. I hit the transmit button and mimicked the guy perfectly, even throwing in a little phlegmy cuff he'd done. Silence. Then the same voice, a little sharper this time. Foo in the Sam Hill was that. I chuckled, about to fess up, but then another voice came on, the exact same voice, saying, "Ricky, is that you? You sound like you swallowed a frog." Now, my name ain't Ricky. And I sure as hell haven't swallowed a frog recently. A cold shiver traced its path down my spine. I glanced in my side mirror, half expecting to see some prankster tailgating me. Nothing. Just the endless Texas blacktop swallowing the fading light. A few miles down the road, I saw him. A Peterbilt, same model as mine. Same faded blue paint job, hauling what looked like the same load of prefabricated sheds I was. And behind the wheel, as clear as day in the gathering dusk, was me. Same scraggly beard. Same worn-out baseball cap. Even the same damn stain on my shirt. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was a hallucination brought on by too much cheap coffee and not enough sleep. But when I looked again, he was still there, pulling alongside me. He gave me a small wave, a disturbingly familiar wave, and a grin that didn't reach his eyes. My foot instinctively pressed the accelerator. The other truck matched my speed, staying right beside me. I could see him clearly now. It was me, but off. His skin was a sickly pale yellow, like old parchment, and his eyes were two black, empty pits. Panic squeezed my chest. This wasn't a prank. This was something far worse. I swerved onto the exit ramp, tires screaming in protest. The other truck followed, its movements mirroring mine with unnerving precision. We tore through a small town, ignoring stop signs and the startled looks of the few people out and about. I glanced in my mirror again. The other me was still there, his grin widening, a grotesque, predatory expression. I had to lose him. I took a sharp turn onto a dirt road, figuring my heavier load could give me an advantage. The road twisted and turned, becoming little more than a track through dense mesquite. I glanced back. He was still there, gaining on me. How was he keeping up? The track opened onto a field. A vast expanse of sunflowers stretching as far as the eye could see. In the center, bathed in the eerie glow of the rising moon, was a strange stone structure. Circular, maybe 20 feet across, with symbols carved into its surface. I'd seen those symbols before, somewhere. The other truck stopped at the edge of the field. The doppelganger stepped out, his movements jerky and unnatural. He raised a hand, pointing at the stone circle. It was an invitation, a command. Fear warred with a strange compulsion. Some part of me, some deep, buried instinct, urged me forward. I slammed on the brakes, tires digging furrows in the dry earth. The doppelganger started walking toward me, his pace slow and deliberate. He didn't speak, but I could hear his voice in my head. A chilling whisper that promised something wonderful and terrifying. It spoke of belonging, of completion, of becoming whole. I shifted into reverse, desperate to escape. But the truck wouldn't budge. I looked down. Roots, thick and gnarled, had snaked out from beneath the sunflowers, wrapping themselves around my tires, holding me fast. The doppelganger stopped a few feet away. His eyes, those empty black pits, bored into me. He raised his hand again, this time revealing a long, curved blade glinting in the moonlight. Then, I remembered. I'd seen that stone circle in a dream, a recurring nightmare that had plagued me for months. The sunflowers, the symbols, the other me, it was all there. In the dream. I always ended up in the center of the circle, the doppelganger standing over me with that same blade. He stepped closer, reaching out a hand that felt cold and clammy. His touch sent a jolt of pure terror through me. I knew with a chilling certainty that this was it. This was the end of the road. He opened his mouth, and his voice, my voice, spoke. "It's time, Ricky. Time to come home." He raised the blade. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. I felt the cold steel against my skin, but instead of pain, there was a strange merging. A feeling of becoming something else, something other. I opened my eyes. I was standing in the center of the stone circle, the blade still in my hand, dripping with a thick, dark fluid. The sunflowers swayed gently in the night breeze, their faces turned towards me, their seeds ripe and full. I looked down at my hands, my skin pale and yellow, my eyes two empty black pits. I smiled, a slow, chilling grin that didn't reach my eyes. I understood now. I was home. And I was waiting. Story 38. The dispatcher called it a hotshot delivery. Expedited. Double the usual rate. All I had to haul were a few barrels marked with some generic corporate logo. No hazmat placards, nothing to raise a brow. Just another load, another mile marker eaten by my Kenworth. Money talks. My gut grumbled, but I shut it up with a gas station burrito the size of a football. First weird thing happened outside Waco. Raccoon sprawled across the asphalt, looking extra road-killed. Flatter than usual, and glowing, just a tad, like a cheap motel vacancy sign. I chalked it up to exhaustion, those flickering Texas sunsets playing tricks on the eyes. Then came Austin. Armadillo. Same story, pancake flat, faintly luminous. But this one twitched, just a little shiver along its bony plates. Okay, maybe I needed stronger coffee. By the time I hit San Antonio, things were officially bonkers. A deer, big as a bick, lay shimmering in the middle of the lane. Its antlers stretched out like skeletal branches, pulsing with that unnerving luminescence. It hauled itself to its feet, a grotesque parody of Bambi, and let out a bellow that would curdle Quiso. I swerved, narrowly avoiding becoming another smear on the interstate. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped jackrabbit. I pulled into a truck stop just outside of Junction. Needed something stronger than coffee. Needed something to settle the churning in my stomach that wasn't related to the gas station burrito. The joint was a typical roadside affair, flickering neon sign, greasy spoon menu, and a clientele that looked like they'd been embalmed and then reanimated with cheap whiskey. I ordered a black coffee and tried to ignore the whispers. See, ever since that glowing raccoon, there'd been these whispers. Not inside my head, thank God, but like the wind rustling through the mesquite, carrying snatches of conversation. Just out of earshot, impossible to decipher, but definitely there. The whispers intensified in the diner, like they were crowding around me, eager to share some terrible secret. Then, I saw it. A withered sunflower, lying on the counter by the cash register. Not exactly a common sight in a grazy spoon. And it was glowing. that same sickly yellow light. The diner's other patrons, all weathered faces and denim overalls, suddenly stopped talking. They turned, as one, their eyes fixed on me. Their smiles stretched, impossibly wide, revealing teeth that were a little too long, a little too sharp. Then, they started humming. A low, droning sound that resonated deep in my bones. I paid for my coffee, dropped a 20 on the counter, a small price for a hasty exit, and bolted. Back in the cab of my Kenworth, I slammed the door, the whispers receding slightly. I floored it, tires spitting gravel, leaving the demonic diner in my rearview. Next few hours were a blur of glowing roadkill and escalating paranoia. Rabbits the size of German shepherds, brush wolves with wings spanning the entire highway. A possum that looked like it had swallowed a lit street lamp. Each one pulsing with that same unsettling light, each one accompanied by the whispers. They were getting closer, louder, more insistent. And the humming, that infernal humming, never stopped. I reached Corpus Christi just before dawn. The delivery point was a sprawling construction site. Rows of prefabricated houses waiting to be assembled. I backed the truck into the designated spot, my hands slick with sweat despite the cool morning air. I jumped out of the cab, eager to be rid of my glowing cargo. But as I reached for the trailer doors, the humming intensified. The whispers became shrieks. 3 figures emerged from between the houses. Tall, gaunt figures draped in dark robes that obscured their features completely. They moved with an unnerving fluidity, their steps silent on the concrete. They stopped before me, their presence radiating an unnatural cold. And then I saw what they were carrying, withered sunflowers. Dozens of them, each glowing with that same sickly yellow light. The figures raised the sunflowers, and their humming became a chilling chant. The ground beneath me trembled. The prefabricated houses around us began to sway, their shadows stretching and distorting in the growing light. I knew, with a horrifying certainty, that I hadn't been hauling just barrels. I'd been hauling something else. Something radioactive. Something that had transformed the roadkill into these monstrous, glowing creatures. And now, these robed figures, these guardians of the glowing sunflowers, were completing whatever horrifying ritual they'd started. The figures moved closer, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. The ground shook violently. A chasm opened beneath the truck, a swirling vortex of darkness consuming everything around it. My Kenworth tilted precariously, the front tires dangling over the abyss. I stumbled backward, the robed figures closing in. Their chanting drowned out the whispers, the humming filling my ears, my mind. The world exploded in a blinding flash of yellow light. I woke up in a sterile white room, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the air. A nurse, crisp white uniform and a practiced smile, bustled around me. She asked me how I was feeling, what I remembered. I tried to tell her about the glowing roadkill, the whispering figures, the sunflowers, the chasm. But the words wouldn't come. They twisted and distorted, replaced by a low, droning hum. The nurse smiled gently, patted my hand. "It's all right, dear. It was just a bad dream." But it wasn't a dream. I knew it wasn't a dream. Because when the nurse turned away, I saw it. Lying on her desk, nestled amongst the charts and pens, a single withered sunflower. And it was glowing. Story 39. The flickering neon sign of the Buckaroo stop buzzed a lonely welcome against the inky Texas sky. 2 a.m., and my eyelids felt like lead weights. Just a quick coffee and back on the blacktop. This stretch of Highway 170 was known for being desolate, but even for this godforsaken strip, the Buckaroo felt abnormally deserted. Not a single car in sight, the pumps looking like skeletal metal sentinels in the pale moonlight. I pulled my rig up beside the only pump displaying a price, a surprisingly low $1.99 a gallon. Figured it was a glitch, but hell, I wasn't complaining. I stepped out, the air still and thick with the scent of something vaguely floral, almost overly sweet. Like someone spilled a vat of cherry syrup and tried masking it with jasmine. It clung to the back of my throat, cloying. The station itself was a relic of a bygone era. Wood paneling, a single window with faded stickers of longhorns and cowboys. Inside, behind the counter, a figure stood motionless, dressed in a crisp, white attendant uniform. They looked like they'd stepped out of a 1950s postcard. Except, something felt wrong. I pushed open the glass door, a little bell jingling discordantly in the quiet. The attendant didn't react, didn't even blink. Just stood there, a fixed, placid smile stretched across their face. It was a smile that didn't quite reach their eyes, which were unsettlingly dark, almost black. "Morning," I rasped, my voice thick with sleep. No response. Just the persistent buzzing of a fluorescent light above, casting a sickly yellow glow over the room. I cleared my throat. "Fill her up, regular. And a black coffee, please." The attendant finally moved, their movements slow, deliberate, almost mechanical. They turned and walked towards the coffee machine, their back ramrods straight. Their uniform was pristine, blindingly white against the gloom of the station interior. Too white, almost luminescent. And there was something off about their gait. A strange stiffness, their legs moving like they were hind, not jointed. While they poured the coffee, I rummaged through my wallet, pulling out a 20. The floral scent seemed stronger inside, mixing with the stale smell of old coffee and something metallic. Like blood, but fainter. The attendant placed the coffee on the counter, the smile still plastered on their face. I laid down the 20. They didn't take it. Just stared, those dark eyes seeming to bore into me. "Keep the change," I mumbled, shifting uncomfortably. Their smile widened, impossibly wide now, stretching beyond the natural limits of human physiology. A low humming sound began to emanate from them, barely audible at first, then growing steadily louder. It vibrated through the floor, through the counter, through my very bones. The humming seemed to be coming from deep within them, resonating in their chest cavity, like a tuning fork struck against bone. The metallic scent intensified. Their eyes, those impossibly black eyes, seemed to dilate, filling their entire sockets. The smile stretched further, revealing teeth that were too long, too sharp, almost needle-like. The skin around their mouth began to peel back, revealing glimpses of something dark and pulsating beneath. My blood ran cold. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But I was rooted to the spot, frozen by a nameless terror. The humming grew louder, the vibration more intense. The attendant leaned forward, their face now a grotesque parody of human features. The smile a gaping maw filled with those needle teeth. Their voice, a distorted, croaky rasp, filled the small space. We appreciate your offering." The last word was swallowed by the humming, which now sounded like 1,000 voices chanting in unison, a chilling, discordant chorus that echoed through the empty station, through the deserted highway, through the vast, empty expanse of the Texas night. My scream died in my throat, choked by the rising tide of terror. I stumbled backward, knocking over a display of stale beef jerky. The attendant continued to lean forward, their forms seeming to stretch, to distort, the white uniform now clinging to something that was no longer human. The floral scent, the metallic tang, the humming, it all coalesced into a single, overwhelming sensation of dread. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I was not going to leave the Buckaroo stop. I was going to become another offering, another silent victim in this desolate corner of Texas, claimed by the spectral attendant and their horrifying ritual. The humming intensified, the attendant's face inches from mine. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. The last thing I heard above the humming, above the chanting, above the pounding of my own terrified heart, was the jingling of the little bell on the door, as if someone else was entering the Buckaroo stop. Story 40. The shimmering heat rising off the asphalt twisted the distant landscape into something unreal. I wiped a bead of sweat from my brow, even though the sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago. This stretch of Texas highway, somewhere between Marfa and nowhere, felt wrong, different. A peculiar sweetness hung in the air, like overripe cantaloupe mixed with something faintly metallic. I'd picked up a load of those factory-made sunrooms in El Paso, bound for Corpus Christi, and figured I'd shave some time by cutting through the back roads. Bad idea. My GPS had gone haywire miles back, and now my cell signal was deader than an armadillo on the median. Then I heard it. A high, reedy voice, almost like a child singing. Beautiful, but unsettlingly out of place in this desolate landscape. It seemed to drift from a cluster of cypress trees ahead, silhouetted against the dying light. Beneath the trees, I saw a flicker of movement. Something pale against the dark trunks. Curiosity, that fickle mistress, pulled me closer. I slowed the rig, the sweetness in the air growing stronger, almost cloying. As I neared the trees, the singing stopped. The flicker of movement was gone. Under the cypress, a small, almost perfectly circular clearing had been carved out of the brush. In the center stood a crude wooden structure, like a child's attempt at a birdhouse, only larger. 3 figures stood around it, robed and motionless. My gut screamed at me to put the pedal down and get out of there, but something held me back. I pulled over, the engine rumbling to a stop, and climbed out of the cab. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the engine cooling. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the stillness. No response. I cautiously approached the clearing, the metallic tang in the air now making my stomach churn. As I stepped into the circle, the robed figures turned. Their faces were hidden by deep hoods, but I could sense their attention focused on me. One of them, the tallest, gestured towards the structure. It was an altar of sorts, fashioned from planks, and on it lay a single, withered sunflower. The figure gestured again, this time to me. I understood. They wanted me to place something on the altar. My eyes scanned the cab. On the dash, a small, painted ceramic armadillo, a souvenir Darla had given me, caught my eye. It seemed harmless enough. I grabbed it and placed it beside the sunflower. As soon as my fingers left the ceramic, the figures moved with unsettling speed. They raised their hands, revealing what looked like pruning shears. Long, curved blades glinted in the fading light. And then they began to chant. A low, croaky drone that vibrated through the very ground beneath my feet. The air grew colder, the sweet smell turning acrid. I backed away, my hand instinctively reaching for the door handle, but my legs wouldn't respond. The chanting intensified, the ground trembling now. Fissures appeared in the earth around the circle, widening, deepening. The figures lowered their hoods, their faces finally visible in the growing darkness. They weren't human. Their skin was stretched taut over sharp bones, their eyes vacant black pits. Their smiles stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. And then I saw what was happening beneath the altar. The earth wasn't just splitting, it was opening into a vast, churning blackness. A gaping chasm yawned before me, and the truck, the ground I stood on, everything was being pulled inexorably towards it. I screamed, a wordless shriek of terror. As the ground gave way, the truck tilted, the cab slamming against the earth, the world exploding into a swirling vortex of black, and the chanting of the robed figures echoing all around me as I plunged into the abyss. Then, a jarring jolt. I was sitting upright in the driver's seat, the engine rumbling beneath me. The sun beat down on the asphalt, the shimmering heat distorting the distant landscape. The sweet, metallic smell was gone. My GPS was working again, showing a clear signal. I looked around, disoriented. The cypress trees, the clearing, the figures, all gone. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? I reached for the ceramic armadillo on the dash. It wasn't there. As I pulled back onto the highway, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. A small cluster of cypress trees, silhouetted against the distant horizon. And beneath them, a flicker of movement, something pale against the dark trunks. That marks the end of this last story. If you enjoyed the video, subscribing to this channel would help me out a lot. I appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next one.